How do you mean no more commission?
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was a battling stone. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
The work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.
Good afternoon. We resume with our next item of business, consideration of Business Motion 20250 in the name of Graeme Day on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a timetable for the Stage 3 consideration of the Referendums Scotland Bill. Could I call on Graeme Day to move this motion?
Move with pleasure, First Minister.
Thank you very much.
First Minister. Presiding Officer.
It's Christmas. It's all right, Mr. Day. There's a counter coup behind you, Mr. Russell. No member has asked to speak against the motion. The question is that motion 20250 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you. So the next item is Stage 3 proceedings on the Referendums Scotland Bill. In dealing with amendments, members should have the bill as amended at Stage 2, that is SP Bill 46A, the marshalled list, and the groupings of amendments. And I will just remind members that the division bell will sound and proceedings will be suspended for 5 minutes for the first vote of the afternoon. The period of voting for that first division will be 30 seconds. Thereafter, there will be 1 minute for the first division after each debate. And members who wish to speak in the debate on any group of amendments should press their request to speak button as soon as possible after I call the group. So now we turn to the marshalled list of amendments. Start with Group 1, referendums to which this Act applies. I call Amendment 1 in the name of Adam Tompkins, grouped with Amendments 21 and 2 Adam Tompkins to move Amendment 1 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I move Amendment 1 in my name, and I say straight away that we will be supporting Amendment 21, which is the only government amendment in this group. And I'll let the Minister speak to that in due course, but I do want to speak to my own amendments, Amendments 1 and 2. Amendments 1 and 2, the operative one is Amendment 2, which would seek to enshrine what's become known as the Gould principle on the face of this legislation, Presiding Officer. Now, Ron Gould, as you will know, was appointed to conduct an independent review into electoral events in Scotland following the combined local authority and Scottish parliamentary elections in May 2007 and published his report later in that year. And in his recommendations, he made what has now become known as the Gould principle, which is to say that electoral legislation, including legislation on referendums, cannot be applied to any election or referendum held within 6 months of the new provision coming into force. That's the Gould principle, and that's the principle which my amendment would seek to give effect to for the purposes of this legislation. And this isn't about delaying any referendum on any subject. It's about ensuring that both those who run referendums for us and those who vote in referendums have enough time to prepare for the referendum, whether they are helping to put it on or helping to participate in it, for its effective delivery. The Gould principle is widely accepted by electoral administrators. The Finance and Constitution Committee was told by the Scottish Assessors Association, for example, that it is important for the effective delivery of a referendum that the rules surrounding the running of it are clear and in place at least 6 months prior to the referendum taking place. The Electoral Commission is of the same view, and the Electoral Commission has recommended that all legislation for any future referendum should be clear at least 6 months before it is required to be implemented. This is to allow sufficient time, Presiding Officer, to allow both campaigners and administrators fully to prepare to comply with the rules once they are in force. But also, of course, it is vital in the interests of the people who matter most in referendums, which is to say the people who vote in referendums. It enables voters to be informed about the issues at stake in the referendum and have confidence in the process. And that is one of the elements of the gold standard of referendums, that we must legislate for referendums so that voters have the fullest possible confidence in the process, leading to a free and fair referendum with the result that has overall legitimacy for the public, both those on the winning and those on the losing sides. And in their report on the Scottish independence referendum in 2014, the Electoral Commission highlighted the benefits of having the legislation being clear, not just 6, but in that case, 9 months before the referendum date. All of this has been accepted by the Cabinet Secretary, who gave evidence to the Finance and Constitution Committee on this bill a few weeks ago. And he accepted in his evidence, as the Finance Committee recorded in its report, that 6 months is indeed the gold standard. So the amendments in my name in this group are designed to give effect to the Gould principle, which is one of the fundamental principles, or ought to be one of the fundamental principles of our electoral law, which is simply to say that all of the rules must be in place 6 months before any electoral event that occurs under those rules. That is the force of Amendments 1 and 2 in my name in this group.
Thank you very much. And I call the Cabinet Secretary to speak to Amendment 21 and the other amendments in this group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think it's important to say at the outset that the vast majority of the amendments and the debates that will be held this afternoon are on technical matters. There are, I think, 2 debates on political matters of some import, but I hope that the Chamber can, as a whole, come together on many of the issues that will be discussed this afternoon, which were ventilated greatly at Stage 2, and solutions were found to issues that were raised at Stage 2, and I think that will become apparent. I should also say what this bill is, because I want to make that absolutely clear. This is a framework bill for referendums. It is not the approval of a specific referendum. The approach that the Scottish Government took to this bill from the very beginning and for the issue is to say, let us put in place a framework. And then let us approach that framework with a specific shorter, and we've now agreed this, shorter bill, not even secondary legislation, but a shorter bill that confirms the subject, confirms the question, confirms the date. So in supporting this bill, all that is being supported is the principle that there will be a piece of legislation which allows and organises referendum. That will become important in a second when I address these amendments. During the Stage 1 evidence, as Mr Tompkins has said, I addressed this issue and I stand by the comments I made at this time. I think that the 6-month period is a reasonable period, but I'm not absolutely committed to it in all circumstances for a variety of reasons. The first reason is that some referendums may not necessarily need this long, depending on the topic. Globally, there are examples of referendums that take place comparatively quickly on comparatively minor matters. So to tie it to 6 months absolutely is not necessary. But there's a second issue, and it has been raised by Mr Tompkins. It is about the ensuring that administrators have the adequate time to know the rules and regulations. This is, as I say, a framework bill. It contains the rules and regulations. There will be no changes to this bill after today, after Stage 3, so people will then know from now on what these are. And therefore the familiarity with of course.
Adam Tompkins.
Very grateful to the Minister for giving way. It's an important point. It is now the case that any future referendum on a devolved matter in Scotland will require an act of this Parliament. That act authorising any referendum on any future devolved subject at any point in the future can, of course, amend this bill. So it isn't quite the case, is it, that this bill can't be amended after today, because this bill could be amended by any future enactment that triggers and authorises a referendum on a devolved matter in Scotland.
The principle of this bill is clear and has been accepted by the committee. This is the framework to which is plugged in some other details of the referendum. So this is how referendums will be run in Scotland. And the administrators and others will know how referendums will be run in Scotland. In a sense, we are catching up because these rules and regulations, some of them are in the equivalent Westminster legislation from the year 2000. But of course, the last time there was any referendum in Scotland organised by the Scottish Parliament, then the different approach was taken. Everything to do pertaining to that referendum was in that bill. This time, we know how they're going to operate. And the key point is, and I return to it, administrators and others will know how referendums will be run. They will know the rules, and therefore the 6 months issue is not an issue in terms of those matters. Now, the government has also said, and agreed to, and we agreed to this at Stage 2, a 10-week referendum period. There are a number of weeks included in appointed designating campaigns. Nothing is being rushed in terms of any potential referendum. And the date of any future referendum will be set out in primary legislation, giving Parliament the ability to amend that date, to move that date, if they felt that it was too soon. So I would urge members not to tie the hands of every subsequent administration, every subsequent request for an administration by an absolute. Nobody is in any doubt that the proper time should pass. That is confirmed here, it's confirmed in the detail of the bill on the referendum period, but to tie it absolutely to 6 months is not only unnecessary, but unhelpful. Presiding Officer, finally, Amendment 21 is a minor but I think valuable technical amendment to put beyond any doubt on the face of the Act that is intended that the Act only applies to a referendum held under an Act of the Scottish Parliament. This will become relevant later this afternoon when we look at the issue of what might happen if dates clash on a referendum. So that is very clear in Amendment 21. I'm glad that Mr Tompkins has indicated that he will be supporting it. I would ask members not to support Mr Tompkins' 2 amendments because they do create an absolute which I don't think is required.
Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Just very briefly, I would like to ask Adam Tompkins if he's listening. I'm not sure as he has. I would like to ask Adam Tompkins in winding up on this group, just to clarify exactly what he intends. If we were to pass the amendments in this group in his name, am I correct in assuming that if the Scottish Government subsequently was to propose a bill for a specific referendum sooner than 6 months before this bill achieves royal assent, then this framework would not apply, and the bill to establish the specific referendum would itself have to copy and paste all of the rules that are in here. So effectively the people administering and participating in that referendum would not have clarity until the subsequent bill had passed. Surely, if that's correct, then the way to achieve the earliest clarity and the longest time period of clarity about the rules is to ensure that the framework bill that we passed today does apply, rather than simply putting all of what's in here into further doubt and confusion.
Thank you very much. And I call on Adam Tompkins to wind up and to press or withdraw.
Well, I'm grateful to Patrick Harvey for that point. The point is simply this, that we had a problem in Scotland in 2007 with multiple electoral events taking place on the same day. We did. And we invited an independent investigator to report on that for us. And he concluded that it would be appropriate for the law to reflect this principle, that the rules should be set 6 months in advance of any event taking place under those rules. And I just think that, given the history that we have with electoral events in Scotland, both elections and referendums, it behooves us to consider and reflect upon those recommendations. I don't think that there should be a referendum on any subject in Scotland within the next 6 months under the rules contained in this bill, because I do think that the rules contained in this bill need to be fully understood, both by those who are helping to run referendums on our behalf and by those who are voting in referendums as fully as possible. And all of the expert testimony is that that takes a minimum of 6 months, and that's the proposal which I'm thinking that we should put into the opening provision of this legislation.
I don't think Mr. giving way, sorry. Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful. Can I just be very clear then? What Adam Tompkins is suggesting is that if, and it's a big if, a referendum was proposed within that time period, the rules should be set later rather than earlier. The rules should be set in the subsequent bill rather than today.
Adam Tompkins.
No, the rules should be those which apply in this bill, but no such referendum should be held within 6 months, because that's what the Gould principle means. So, Presiding Officer, during a number of the debates that we'll have this afternoon, we will hear references to not the Gould principle but the gold standard. Right? What we're trying to do, it seems to me, in this legislation is to enact state-of-the-art referendums legislation for Scotland that is future-looking, therefore needs to have a degree of flexibility, which we'll talk about in some of the debates in later groups, but which needs to reflect the best possible national and international practice of the running and holding of referendums. And the key element to that is surely that we must, all of us, put the interests of voters first. And that's what the Electoral Commission is there for. The Electoral Commission is there to identify what the best interests of voters are. And the Electoral Commission have said that they support the Gould principle, that they think it is in the interest of voters that referendum rules and indeed election rules are set and are clear in legislation at least 6 months in advance of any referendum or election taking place under those rules. So if we are serious about trying today to enact the best possible legislation for referendums, in the plural, in the future in Scotland, we should be considering supporting rather than resisting amendments such as this. And I will press these amendments.
Thank you very much. So the question is that Amendment 1 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Oh. We're not agreed. So we're going to move to a vote, but that means we'll have to have a 5-minute suspension to call members to the chamber. So a 5-minute suspension.
How do you mean no more commission?
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. If I went to BBC Scotland and I said, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was a balanced on. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
About the work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.
Thank you, colleagues. We resume, and the question is that Amendment 1 be agreed to, and members may cast their votes now. This will be a 30-second vote. Amendment 1. The result of the vote on Amendment 1 in the name of Adam Tompkins is yes 54, no 67. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call Amendment 21 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary to move. Moved. Thank you. The question is that Amendment 21 be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're double check. Are we all agreed? Yes. Thank you. That is agreed. I call Amendment 2 in the name of Adam Tompkins, already debated. Adam Tompkins to move or not move? Moved. That is moved. The question is that Amendment 2 be agreed to. Are we agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote on Amendment 2. Members may vote now. The result of the vote on Amendment number 2 in the name of Adam Tompkins is yes 55, no 66. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. We're going to turn now to Group 2, the referendum questions. I call Amendment 6 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, grouped with Amendments 7, 3, 8, 9 and 10. And I would point out to members that if Amendment 3 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendment 8 as it will be preempted. Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 6 and speak to all the amendments in this group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The issue of question testing has been the most difficult and probably the most divisive issue in this bill. We have debated the issue at length and agreed concessions at stage 2 in an attempt to make this framework both workable and agreeable to the Parliament. And I have brought forward today further enhancements to the proposal, which was accepted at stage 2 by the committee. I'm pleased to say these follow further discussions with the Electoral Commission, which has stated that these amendments will enable the Parliament to seek advice whenever it wishes to do so. And this addresses the Commission's concern at stage 2. Amendments 6 to 10 require the Electoral Commission, where its views on the wording of a referendum question have been requested either by the Scottish Government or by this Parliament, or when being consulted before the lodging of a motion to extend the validity period of a question from the preceding session of the Parliament, must lay its views before the Parliament as soon as reasonably practical and publish those views. The Commission, therefore, is in the position to respond not just to the Government, but also to the Parliament on these issues. And it's standard practice for the Commission to publish its views, but including a duty to publish, as we do in this bill, means that the process can be seen as entirely transparent. The amendments at stage 2 required ministers to lay a report before the Parliament, stating any views as to the intelligibility of the question expressed by the Electoral Commission. However, on reflection and in discussion with the Commission, I've also agreed that the Commission should offer its views directly to the Parliament. Amendments 6 to 9 therefore provide for this. Amendment 10 would allow the Parliament, through a resolution, to consult the Electoral Commission on the wording of a question. Again, this allows the Parliament at any time to both seek a view on whether a question remains valid and to seek the Commission's expert advice on the intelligibility of the question. This responds to requests from the Commission and adjusts the amendment at stage 2. Now, I hope members will acknowledge the major concessions the Government has made on this issue with the aim of achieving cross-party agreement. Also, members will note that the Electoral Commission has said my amendments will enable the Parliament to seek advice whenever it wishes to do so, fulfilling the Commission's requests after stage 2. And I therefore urge members to support these amendments as a result. If I turn to Amendment 3 in the name of Adam Tompkins, I'm disappointed that this amendment has been brought forward. When Mr Tompkins' amendment at stage 2, which have required all the questions to be tested, even if tested previously in the same session of Parliament, was rejected by the lead committee. At stage 2, Mr Tompkins made the point that we must be sure not to bypass the Electoral Commission. My proposals do absolutely fulfil that requirement. The Electoral Commission is central to my proposals. But a blanket requirement for all questions to be retested, rather than asking the Commission for their views, isn't necessary. The bill ensures that the Commission is able to provide its expert advice to Parliament. If the Commission's view is that a previously tested question requires further testing, the Parliament can request the Commission to do so. Now, given the Finance and Constitution Committee agreed with the principles of my proposal at stage 2 and that further adjustments to that proposal have been welcomed by the Commission, I ask members, yes, of course.
Can I appeal to the Cabinet Secretary? If he seeks to bring people on board, if he's trying to build consensus on this, he is going exactly the wrong way about it by seeking to manipulate the situation and the question. And I say that to him with 100% sincerity, that if you seek to bring people on board You have to be seen as 100% straight on this, and seeking to manipulate it will have the opposite effect.
Cabinet Secretary.
I mean, I don't think Mr Finlay, with respect, has been listening to the points I've been making. We have moved... I'm sorry, I just want to make this point very clear. I have moved a very considerable degree to ensure that not only the government but the Parliament can seek permission, that any question will expire. The only small area of difference between us will be whether a question can be used within a parliamentary term or whether it cannot be used in a parliamentary term. And let me give Mr Finlay an example of why this is, two examples actually, of why this is necessary. The first one is that if a bill were to pass in the first year of a parliament for a referendum, and for any reason that referendum was delayed, then that could still continue to be asked during the term of that parliament. That's not unreasonable. A question must expire at some stage. It can't be reused in a second term without the Parliament specifically supporting that. Now, why would it be reused? Because sometimes, and I think you just have to look at the evidence of this, sometimes questions have a validity and are well understood. This is the point I made at the start of this process. The opinion poll evidence on this is absolutely unequivocal. The questions that is well understood, recognised, used repeatedly, for example, in opinion polling. No, can I just finish this? It is absolutely obvious that that would be something which the public know about. But even so, I have accepted that the Parliament has the right to do things and the Commission has the right, because the Commission will be able to say what its position is. And nobody can hide from that. The Commission will be able to say what its position is. And if the Commission says that should be tested again, in those circumstances, I am absolutely sure the Parliament and the Government will agree with it. So far from avoiding things, we have in actual fact accepted everything that has been put to us. I'll give way.
Adam Tompkins.
Before to the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. I mean, this is the most crucial point of this afternoon's debate. If what the Cabinet Secretary says is true, if there are referendum questions that are clear and well understood by the public, what does he have to fear?
Cabinet Secretary.
Nothing to fear, and I have absolutely nothing to fear, and the Commission has made it clear that they are satisfied with the progress. The Commission has said they are satisfied with this progress. I made this point to Mr Tompkins at questions. There has been the word satisfied is in the Commission briefing. Now, in all these circumstances, what we have done here is a sensible, common sense, giving way to the Parliament Commission, listening to the arguments and putting forward a reasonable, no, not at this moment, and getting a reasonable position. I'm asking the Parliament to be reasonable about the progress they've made and not unreasonable. And I have to say, Mr Tompkins so far has not been reasonable about this, but I hope other parties will look at this and realise the progress that has been made, which is overwhelming. If I must, on you go.
Mike Rumbles.
I'd like to thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. But what he said about the Electoral Commission isn't simple. It's just not true. I'm quoting from the letter to all MSPs. It says, we continue to be of the view that it should a future referendum on Scottish independence be brought forward, the Commission should be required to reassess the question, regardless of whether it's been asked before.
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm sorry, the Commission says it is satisfied with the progress that has been made. That is clear from the document. Now what we have got is ignoring the progress that has been made, ignoring the fact that the Parliament will have the right, ignoring the fact that the Commission have the right in order to go back to where we started from. That's not a sensible position to be in, and I would ask members to think very carefully about this, because this has been a major step forward, and I say a major concession, several major concessions by the government. And I would hope there would be a pragmatic recognition of the progress that has been made, rather than reverting to political type, which is unfortunately what we've seen.
Adam Tompkins to speak to Amendment 3 and the other amendments in this group.
Presiding Officer, there's a very simple principle at stake here that has applied so far to every referendum held in the United Kingdom since the creation of the Electoral Commission. That is that ministers propose referendum questions. The Electoral Commission tests those electoral commissions with the interests of voters put first, and Parliament then decides on the basis of recommendations that are made to us by the Electoral Commission. And what the Cabinet Secretary is seeking to do here is to rig those rules. And that is completely unacceptable. The Electoral Commission, throughout this entire process, has been robust, fearless and entirely consistent. What the Electoral Commission said earlier in this process, and I quote, the Electoral Commission firmly recommends that it must be required to provide views and advice to the Scottish Parliament on the wording of any referendum question, regardless of whether we have previously published views on proposed wording. That was at stage 1, Presiding Officer. And now, here we are at stage 3, and the Cabinet Secretary, both at general questions earlier and in this debate, is willfully misleading the Chamber about what the Electoral Commission is saying. The Electoral Commission is saying, and I quote from its briefing, "We continue to be of the view that should a future referendum on Scottish independence be brought forward, the Commission should be required to reassess the question, regardless of whether it will take place within the so-called validity period of the Cabinet Secretary's imagination. This will ensure," says the Electoral Commission, "confidence in the legitimacy of the referendum result." There is only one amendment, Presiding Officer, in this group that gives effect to that view of the Independent Electoral Commission, and that amendment is the one in my name. The amendments in Mr Russell's name continue to, I think, actually do him quite a disservice, because they are dishonourable. What he is trying to do is he is rigging the rules of a future referendum in this country to suit his partisan interests. Presiding Officer, the Finance Committee, this Parliament's Finance and Constitution Committee, unanimously recommended that he should not be allowed to get away with this. They unanimously recommended that before stage 2, Mr Russell should seek the agreement, not the satisfaction, however we're not really satisfied, of the Electoral Commission, but the agreement of the Electoral Commission before stage 2. He manifestly failed to do that. He hasn't even sought their agreement or achieved or attained their agreement before stage 3. The Electoral Commission are not satisfied that, as this bill stands, the Electoral Commission will not be required to reassess the intelligibility of a referendum question previously been used. Why is this the position? It's the position because it suits the SNP, or they think it suits the SNP. It doesn't suit voters. And if we were serious, as I said earlier this afternoon, if we were serious about passing legislation for referendums in Scotland that met the highest international standards of best practice, then this Parliament would accept my amendment and reject all of Mr Russell's amendments, because this Parliament would not stand for the rigging of a future referendum in Scotland.
Thank you. I call Mike Rumbles to be followed by Alec Rowley.
The Liberal Democrats support Amendment 3 in Adam Tompkins' name, because it's the right thing to do. On this issue, the Electoral Commission have clearly said, and every MSP has received this, so we cannot pretend we don't know it. They said, we continue to be of the view that should a future referendum on Scottish independence be brought forward, the Commission should be required to reassess the question regardless of whether it will take place within the validity period or not. This will ensure confidence. It will ensure confidence in the legitimacy of the referendum result. Surely that is what we all want. Presiding Officer, this is a very serious issue indeed. It's not a small matter. And the Electoral Commission are of the view that any future question does need to be assessed, and if previously asked, reassessed in the light of experience. Now, any framework bill like this should really have support from right across the chamber. It shouldn't be a controversial bill. Unfortunately, the SNP government have made it a very partisan issue, and Mike Russell has made it a very partisan issue by trying to circumvent the Electoral Commission's input over the question the Scottish Government wants to re-ask. The Cabinet Secretary is being deliberately disingenuous about what the Electoral Commission is saying to us. We all know what they're saying to us. It's not what Mike Russell has said. This clear attempt at manipulation is not acceptable, and it shouldn't be acceptable to anybody in this chamber. And that's why Amendment 3 is so essential, to put this wrong right. The very idea that there needs to be a so-called validity period is a nonsense, and it's simply designed to enable the SNP government to fix the question that they wish to put. This undermines the whole bill. If Amendment 3 does not succeed because the two parties in this chamber that are supportive of it, as I assume the Greens are, I would love to be convinced that they're listening to the argument. Well, that's good. I'm pleased they are. Maybe I'm doing the Greens a disservice, but I'd like to hear what the Greens have to say about this. But the SNP government is certainly trying to fix this. The very idea that MSPs have to articulate this concern should be a real worry to everybody in the chamber. Now, to me, the mask of nationalism here has really slipped. It has. The whole idea of a so-called validity period for the question to be asked is an attempt by the SNP government to win any future referendum by hook or by crook. Amendment 3 restores this bill to what it should be. It should be an agreed framework bill. If Amendment 3 is not passed, then the Liberal Democrats will oppose this bill at decision time.
Alec Rowley to be followed by Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. If the SNP members and the Green members do not support Professor Tompkins' amendment today, then they're setting this bill up not to be the gold standard of referendums, but to be seen very much as a bill that has been put through in order to rig the question. And that's the reality of this situation. I cannot for the life of me understand why the government will not listen to the overwhelming expertise and the advice that has been given. On the issue of the question testing, expert advice has been absolutely clear. At stage 1, the Electoral Commission told committee that they strongly believe that they should be asked to test the question even when the question has been asked before. Their view was that a formal testing of the question helps to provide confidence and assurance to the voter and to the Parliament that is proposing the question, and with regard to the integrity of the process to establish that the question is clear, is transparent, is neutral in its setting. Who would object to that, and why would you ignore that advice, I have to ask myself, other than you want to have the opportunity, if you need it, to rig the question? The Law Society noted that would be very concerning if it was assumed that once approved, the wording of a question is suitable moving forward. At stage 2, the government rejected opposition amendments and amended the bill to create this validity period. This represents a period of time during which the question is subject to less scrutiny by the Electoral Commission, and that is simply not acceptable. If best practice in this area is not the government's key concern, we have to assume that they are seeking to circumvent the proper process. We will support Professor Tompkins' Amendment 3 to delete this validity period. I say to you, you can sit in this Parliament and shout and hee-haw all you wish. The reality at the end of the day is that if we're going to have this bill, it has to be fair, it has to be transparent, and no political party in this chamber should be able to rig a referendum question.
Patrick Harvey. Thank you. Thank you. Patrick Harvey. Order, please. Order, please. Thank you. Order. Patrick Harvey to be followed by Tom Arthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I couldn't hear you call me the first time for the sound of these demands for an end to partisanship in the Chamber, which were ringing in all of our ears. Look, I do wish that this was not being seen as a partisan issue, and I do think that framework legislation on referendums is something that we should be able to agree on. And I want to assure Mike Rumbles that I have listened to the arguments not just on this aspect, but on all aspects of this bill. And I would like to hope that those who've engaged actively in the committee process will recognise that I have publicly urged the Cabinet Secretary to give ground from the start of this bill and to respect the independence of the Commission. And I think he has given ground. Look, there are 3 paragraphs in the Commission's briefing that we've all received. And I think with the call for an end to partisanship, but the language of rhetoric around rigging the rules or manipulation or the mask of nationalism, this is the language of performative partisanship, and I don't think that it helps. The 3 paragraphs. Well, I've been accused of not listening to others. Perhaps members want to listen. There are 3 paragraphs in this. The first says that the Commission is concerned to ensure that the Parliament is able to access the Commission's independent advice on the intelligibility of a proposed referendum question at any point it requests it. If we hadn't achieved that, if we hadn't achieved a position that ensures that the Parliament will be able to access that advice, I wouldn't be recommending my colleagues to vote in favour of this bill. We have achieved that position. The second, I will in a moment. The second 2 paragraphs, and there are some people choosing only to interpret what they like about one or other of these 2 paragraphs. The second one says, we are satisfied that the government amendments on the question assessment process will enable Parliament to seek our advice wherever it wishes to do so, and the Commission will be able to put our views directly before the Parliament. The third paragraph says, we continue to be of the view that a future referendum on Scottish independence, should it be brought forward, that the Commission should be required to reassess the question. And that can happen. Under this bill, as amended by the Government, that requirement can be placed by this Parliament. It will be for this Parliament to make that determination at any time when a bill is brought before it to establish a specific referendum. I indicated to Mike Rumbles that I would give way, and if there's time, I'll come to Mr Johnson after.
Mike Rumbles.
I thank Patrick Harvey for giving way. But the Electoral Commission said the Commission should be required by this legislation to reassess the question regardless of whether it's been asked before. And in fact, I think Patrick Harvey is incorrect. According to the bill, if such a referendum came forward during this session of Parliament, it would still fall into the validity period.
Patrick Harvey.
Well, I would just draw Mike Rumble's attention to the paragraph as it's written. We continue to be of the view that should a future referendum on Scottish independence be brought forward, the Commission should be required to reassess the question. It doesn't say that that should be in this bill. Any referendum which is established will be established by a subsequent bill, by a piece of legislation which this Parliament will be able to vote on. So that the ability of Parliament to make that requirement of the Electoral Commission will be unchanged. I think we should recognise that the Commission is satisfied with the changes that have been made by this bill, and simply to delete whole sections which have satisfied the Commission's concerns, I think that would be more worthy of words like manipulation than the ways others have used it. If there's still time, I'll give way.
Daniel Johnson.
I thank Patrick Harvey for giving way, and with the greatest of respect, there is a difference between the words can and must. And we either believe the Electoral Commission is an important part of this process in terms of being an arbiter of fairness, or we do not. And if we believe that it is, then there must be a requirement for them to act as such an arbiter. But furthermore, can I say this, that this boils down to a question, that if a question is tested once and deemed to be valid, that it is valid for all times and in perpetuity. And what Patrick Harvey is therefore arguing is that the context of a question is of no interest, is of no import whatsoever, and that cannot be right, because culture changes, understandings changes, context changes, and when they do, the question changes. And that is why a question would have to be retested, regardless of whether it had been tested before by the Electoral Commission. That's what's at stake. And I would be grateful if Patrick Harvie could answer that point.
Patrick Harvie.
Well, I do think that in using phrases like in perpetuity or for all time, Daniel Johnson may be misreading what is in front of us. I don't think that's what's being proposed. What is being proposed, and to directly answer his point, is that it will be for this Parliament, in passing legislation which establishes any specific future referendum, to decide whether it wishes to require the commitment. That it will still be within our power to do, or the power of any subsequent Parliament. So I am satisfied, as the Commission is, with the changes that have been made, and I do fear that some people, perhaps predictably, are turning this into a proxy for issues way beyond framework legislation for referendums in general. I will be opposing Mr Tompkins' amendment.
And I call on the Cabinet Secretary to wind up in this group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to, if possible, take some of the heat out of this, because I did say at the start of it, that I thought it had been divisive, and it remains divisive, and I want to try and stick to the facts of this matter. Patrick Harvie is right that the third paragraph of the Electoral Commission's section on this it is entirely possible for that to be used in the legislation to allow that testing. The question arises of what the Commission asked to happen and what has happened. And I have moved on all the issues very substantially indeed. And there's just no doubt about that. If we start at the beginning of this, then at the first stage, the committee asked me to do things for the second stage. We entered into discussion, we brought forward proposals, and in those proposals, the Commission suggested further changes, which we then accepted. So all the proposals that are there have been accepted. The issue of whether or not a question should always be tested, it is not for in perpetuity. That is a misreading, to put it as kindly as I can, what the legislation says. It means that within a single parliamentary term, a question can continue to be valid during that term. That is all it means. Mr Rumbles is also wrong to say that a question is still valid. There is no question that is still valid in Scotland, because this parliamentary term has not passed any question. So there is no validity of any existing question. Should there be a recommendation to use that question, again, can I just make this point, it's really important, then the Parliament here will have the right to say to the Commission that should be tested, and indeed it can be built into the legislation that exists. So there has been very considerable movement forward. I'm not going to react to some of the over-the-top remarks made by Mr Tompkins. This is a serious bill with serious intent, and the only small area, in my view, of difference is whether a question would continue to have validity in a single parliamentary term. That is the issue. I've heard your arguments, Mr Rumbles. I've heard your arguments, Mr Rumbles. Really, we are now at the stage making a decision on whether that point is worth this division, or whether, in actual fact, in common sense understanding, is that language does not change, and meaning does not change in the period of 4 or 5 years. And to suggest that it does, I'm afraid, is exaggerating beyond anything I could accept. So I would move my amendments.
Thank you very much. And we're going to move to Amendment 6. The question is that Amendment 6 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 7 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary to move.
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 7 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 3 in the name of Adam Tompkins. Adam Tompkins to move.
Moved.
That is moved, and I would remind members that if Amendment 3 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendment 8. The question is that Amendment 3 be agreed to. Are we agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote on Amendment 3. This will be a 1-minute division. The result of the vote on amendment number 3 in the name of Adam Tompkins is yes 54, no 67. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. Can I call amendment 8 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary? Cabinet Secretary to move. That is moved. The question is that amendment 8 be agreed to. Are we agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call amendment 9. Cabinet Secretary to move.
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 9 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Thank you. I call amendment 10. Cabinet Secretary to move.
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 10 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Turn now to Group 3, the power to change date of referendum if UK election on the same date. I call Amendment 22 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary in a group on its own and the Cabinet Secretary to move and speak to Amendment 22.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I hope this will steer us into calmer and more calmer waters. Presiding Officer, during the discussion at stage 2 around Adam Tompkins' proposed Amendment 80, which identified issues around there being 2 polls on the same day, I undertook to discuss ways of avoiding such a situation with Mr Tompkins. Mr Tompkins subsequently agreed to withdraw his amendment. In line with that undertaking, Mr Tompkins and I have met and discussed ways in which we could avoid 2 polls, one of which would be out with the control of the Scottish Parliament falling on the same day. This amendment gives effect to the outcome of those discussions. I should start by saying that if, for whatever reason, a poll is set for the same day, which has been set by this Parliament for the date of a referendum, then in the first instance I would expect this Parliament to consider whether there is a need to change the date of a referendum. However, there is a slight possibility that a situation may arise where this Parliament is not in a position to make such a decision. That is where there is an early Westminster general election, the issue being that the date of such a poll may be set with little notice. Therefore, this amendment allows for the presiding officer to delay the date of a referendum by up to 6 weeks if the Parliament is either dissolved or in recess and can't, for whatever reason, be recalled to make a decision. The presiding officer will, following consultation with the Electoral Commission, have the power to appoint by statement a new date for the referendum, which is no later than 6 weeks after the original date. Members will appreciate the need to use this power is very unlikely to arise, but following the concerns which have been expressed by members of the risk of 2 polls falling on the same day, I brought forward this amendment to address those concerns. Taken together, these options mean that there is no reason why the date of a referendum should fall as the same day as another national poll, unless, and it's important to say this, there is a positive decision by this Parliament for that to take place. I hope that members would agree with me that this amendment addresses the concerns expressed by the Parliament, and therefore, Presiding Officer, I'll be moving Amendment 22.
Thank you. And I call Adam Tompkins.
I'd like to say, Presiding Officer, that I'm satisfied with this amendment and there is no however.
Thank you very much. Does the Cabinet Secretary wish to add anything?
Just delighted to hear the word satisfied used.
The question is that Amendment 22 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Turn to Group 4, Report on Conduct of the Referendum. Can I call Amendment 4 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary in a group on its own and the Cabinet Secretary to move and speak to Amendment 4.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I have to say that this amendment, which is number, one moment, we're getting through them so quickly that I'm moving on too quickly myself, number 4. Excuse me. During stage 2 on the 27th of November, James Kelly agreed not to press amendments which would require the Electoral Commission to consult with the Commission for Equality and Human Rights and to include their representations in its report on the conduct of the referendum. Mr Kelly's decision was probably due to concerns expressed around only requiring consultation with one particular body rather than a range of bodies. I would have had no objection to Mr Kelly's proposed amendment had it said that the Electoral Commission was expected or required to consult a range of bodies. In keeping with that view, I have therefore brought forward this amendment to require the Commission to consult with a range of bodies when drafting their report. We did consider whether a specific list of bodies or individuals to consult would be appropriate, but since there could be a referendum on any subject, it's not possible to produce a definitive list. I've therefore deliberately left the Commission flexibility to consult with those bodies they think may have an interest in a particular referendum. I want, however, for the record, Presiding Officer, to clarify that it's already normal practice for the Electoral Commission to consult widely when drafting a report on any electoral event. My amendment simply gives statutory effect to something that already happens in practice. I hope members will agree that consultation with the relevant persons when the Electoral Commission are drafting their report is appropriate, and therefore they will support this amendment.
Thank you. No other member indicates they wish to speak, so we move straight to the question. The question is that Amendment 4 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. We're going to turn now to Group 5. This is the power to modify Act by regulations. Can I call Amendment 11 in the name of Adam Tompkins, grouped with Amendment 12, and Adam Tompkins to move Amendment 12 and speak to both amendments?
Move Amendment 11, probably, Presiding Officer.
Amendment 11.
Whichever, moved. Presiding Officer, as we've heard, this bill is forward-facing. It is framework legislation for referendums to be held in the future in Scotland. And as introduced, Section 37 of this bill enabled ministers, would have given ministers really quite broad powers to amend this bill in the future by order or by regulation in order to take into account developments elsewhere in electoral law. And the Finance and Constitution Committee recognised that there needed to be a degree of flexibility and dynamism about this bill to enable it to be modified in this way in the future, but that at the same time Parliament's interests needed to be more fully safeguarded than they were in the bill as it was introduced, so that we have effective and robust parliamentary scrutiny of those order-making powers. And the government, unlike its position with regard to question testing, has been constructive in engaging with opposition members on this question. And these amendments in my name have been prepared in cooperation with the government, for which I thank the Cabinet Secretary and his officials. So these amendments do not prohibit ministers, they far from it, they do not prohibit ministers from making future modifications by secondary instruments to provisions of this legislation, but they ensure that in that process Parliament's interests as an effective and robust scrutineer of government policy are protected, and I move the amendments.
Thank you very much. And the question is that amendment... I call the Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I just want to say I welcome these amendments. As Mr Tompkins has said, I gave an undertaking to discuss with Mr Tompkins how we might widen the bodies that should be consulted. These amendments put what is normal practice onto a statutory footing. Changes to electoral legislation are already shared widely with the electoral community. The Government welcomes comments from anyone involved in elections and now referendums. I should point out, however, that just because a body or individual is not included in the formal consultation doesn't mean they haven't had the opportunity to contribute at an earlier stage of the process. The formal constitution takes place once the regulations are available in draft form, and it occurs at the end of the consultation process before regulations will be laid. These amendments address the issue raised at stage 2, and I think do so to the satisfaction of the member who raised them, and therefore I would encourage the Chamber to support them.
Thank you. Can I ask Adam Tompkins if he wishes to add anything in the way of winding up? The question, therefore, is that Amendment 11 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I ask Adam Tompkins to move Amendment 12? Thank you. The question is that Amendment 12 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you. I'm going to turn now to Group 6. This is the consultation on the role of referendums in the democratic process, and I call Amendment 23 in the name of Patrick Harvey, in a group on its own, and Patrick Harvey to move and speak to Amendment 23.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I move Amendment 23, and I do so with the intention of airing some issues for debate rather than ultimately for pressing this to the vote. And I just wanted to make that clear at the outset. In amongst the sound and the fury of some of the issues that we've disagreed with each other about in this bill, there have been occasionally some really interesting and much deeper debates about challenges to our democratic process and some of the questions which cannot reasonably be resolved fully in this bill. Overwhelmingly, the evidence has been in favour of the idea of a framework bill for referendums, but it's clear also that this framework bill for referendums is not sufficient as a vehicle to address some of the wider and deeper questions about the state of our democracy. We've also got two pieces of legislation going through Parliament at the same time addressing elections. And they are also necessary pieces of legislation, but in themselves not adequate to address these deeper questions. Some of these questions came up in amendments that I moved during the committee process, for example, on false statements. We know that it is a criminal offence to make false statements during an election about a candidate. But that kind of restriction, that kind of requirement for honesty in the electoral process and in campaigning doesn't apply to the issues in an election any more than it does to the issues in a referendum. There is no equivalent of the offence of making false statements in relation to referendums. And I understand the reasons why the proposals that are brought at stage 2 were not supported by the committee or by the government. These are questions which do require deeper thought. And some of the contributions that Adam Tompkins made during the committee stages about the reasons why false statements about candidates might once have been more relevant than they are now, with the focus of local campaigning on individual candidates having been much more prominent in previous generations than the focus today on national issues and national figures. There were also discussions about the regulation of online and offline activity and campaigning. And I think even though we've seen some progress here, and we'll debate that again a little bit later, I do think we still need to recognise that the way we regulate online campaigning is based on models that were designed for the previous century's needs. We don't yet have answers to a lot of these questions. As well as that, there is the interaction of the different forms of democracy that now operate in our country. We have representative democracy. We are here within a representative democratic chamber, and we also have direct democracy in the shape of referendums. The story of the last few years of UK turmoil has in some ways been about the conflict between direct and representative democracy, what happens when those two systems clash. And we are also now, I'm pleased to say, exploring greater use of deliberative democracy as well, through the use of citizens' assemblies. There are questions yet to be resolved about how we expect representative, direct and deliberative democratic processes to interact and what their relative role will be. So I've brought this amendment in order to give the government an opportunity to reflect on what it thinks should be the vehicle for consideration of these issues. And frankly, you know, I'm not fixated on whether it should be a consultation or a committee inquiry or a piece of work through the Law Commission or discussions with the Electoral Commission, but there needs to be some vehicle for debating these wider issues, because there are fundamental vulnerabilities to our democratic processes in the 21st century which have not been addressed, can't be addressed by this bill, and I'm keen to hear what the government's view and the view of other MSPs might be as to how we go about addressing those wider questions which can't be resolved in this bill.
Thank you. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. One of the positive natures of this bill and its outcomes has been some of the debate that has arisen in committee about what our democracy should be doing and how we should move forward with legislating for, but not restricting or discouraging participation in our democracy. And Mr Tompkins has also brought those issues forward, asking, I think, useful questions about what referenda would be for, how that would fit with other developments, as Mr Harvey has suggested, citizen assembly and direct deliberative democracy, and how we might properly, as a parliament and as parliamentarians, consider those matters, reflect upon them and move them forward. And I'm very sympathetic to that, and I'm grateful to Patrick Harvey for bringing this amendment to at least raise it within this context of the bill and to see how we would move forward from it. I want to say a word or two in a moment about some of the detail of this amendment to point out how difficult it is. But during the election just finished, there was, for example, a clearly documented activity of a Leave activist encouraging online advertising, supporting parties which were designed to split the anti-Tory vote. In other words, it was false flag campaigning. Now, that will be very hard to regulate, but it is there and it is happening now. And some of the issues that we've considered on digital imprints, which we will consider again shortly, reflect are part of that, and we need to talk about it. But above it all is the use of falsehood and false news. Above it all is saying things which are demonstrably untrue and are designed in order to undermine the democratic process or to make points which deflect people from considering real and serious issues. And we must consider how that will affect our democracy. Now, the Law Commission has been undertaking a review of electoral law, including assessing whether electoral law is modern, simple and fit for purpose. That's not the entire remit in this, but it's a start for it. And that report is due in early 2020. It would seem to me inevitable and immensely desirable that committees of this Parliament should look at that report, but they might, and this is before committees of this Parliament, they might want to look at it in a wider context. And they might want to consult on that report as the start of a process in which they say, how can we tackle some of these issues? The present electoral law that deals with false statements about candidates is there and is used. But it is no longer adequate or fit for purpose because there are other issues which have arisen out of it. We understand where that came from. What we do next, and what one might call the frontier of electoral law, given the changes we see taking place, is very important indeed. So I'm very happy to encourage a process in this Parliament and to support it in any way I can that takes these issues and begins to move them forward, and also asks what the role of referendums is, what the issues are for citizens' assemblies and how those interact with this Parliament and with the use of referendums. About the regulation of campaigning, usual social media and online media, about criminal penalties and the effect on the validity of a referendum result from false campaigning. All those matters need to be looked at, and if we can find a process to do so, it will be supported. But we must also be aware that we mustn't do anything to narrow or restrict democratic participation, and we mustn't do anything to make elections harder to run. For example, a consultation to be started within 3 months of royal assent of this bill would probably be far too tight. We would need to actually have a longer period. The laying of a copy of any consultation before this Parliament for 90 days, well, it may be that the committee might want to recommend legislation of some sort or another. So there will be consultation anyway, but again, perhaps too restrictive. I'm keen to help support this, the idea of talking about this further, of coming to conclusions, of looking at the evidence and making sure we understand what we need to do. I hope Mr Harvey recognises that. I can see assent coming from other parts of the chamber. I think supporting this actively is important, but if Mr Harvey does not pursue the amendments, I understand he intends not to, that's not the end of this process, that will be the start of the process, and I give him that assurance.
Thank you very much. And I would call on Patrick Harvey to wind up.
Thank you. It's probably the case that at the start of devolution, at the start of this Parliament, just over 20 years ago, we might have thought, or the general view might have been taken, that the democratic process was generally a reserved matter. We hadn't yet legislated in terms of local elections. We didn't have the power to legislate in relation to Scottish Parliament elections, and referendums were kind of, well, not yet the mode du jour, should we say. Clearly now, we're at a point where this Parliament has responsibility, and it's gained it incrementally, has got responsibility for the democratic process and the robustness and the fairness of the democratic process. And there are severe threats to that democratic process. We could be at a point where we start to see our democratic process go even further down the rabbit hole of untruth and conspiracy theories, of not only lack of transparency in online campaigning, but data harvesting and manipulation, which is either illegal or unethical, and which greatly enhances the power of those in our electoral process who have money and who have the will to hide where they get their money from. We have threats that we're all aware of about international manipulation and attacks against our democratic process. We could be at the point where we see our democratic process continue to spiral downward, away from the transparent and accountable method of giving power to the public that it's supposed to be. Or we could start to take responsibility for those challenges and recognise that we don't yet have answers to those fundamental questions. I hope that every political party, not just in the implementation of the legislation that we're putting forward today, but perhaps in the period of time that we have to consider what should be in manifestos for the 2021 election, I hope all political parties will recognise that there is a major overhaul required in our democratic processes if it is going to be robust, resilient and fair in the future. That being said, I will seek leave to withdraw the amendment that I've moved in this group, but I hope that all political parties will engage very actively in the questions which have not yet been defined, let alone answered.
Thank you very much. And Mr Harvey wishes to withdraw Amendment 23. Does anyone object? No one objects. That's good. We're going to move on to Group 7, Referendum Expenses. Can I call Amendment 5 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, in a group on its own, Cabinet Secretary to move and speak to Amendment 5.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. During Stage 2 on the 27th of November, when we were discussing excluding the additional costs associated with an individual's disability from campaigners' expenditure limits, amendments which were taken and accepted, Patrick Harvey asked if I had considered dealing with the issue of translations into other languages in the same way as translations for the purpose of disability. In response, I undertook to look at the issue. I've now considered Patrick Harvey's suggestion. My officials have discussed it with the Electoral Commission, who are responsible for monitoring campaign expenditure. And I'm therefore pleased to acknowledge that Patrick Harvey has raised a valid issue, which is now being attended to. I have brought forward this amendment which will exclude from campaigners' expenditure limits any reasonable expenditure associated with the translation of referendum materials into languages other than English. I'd like to emphasise we're only talking here about the cost reasonably attributable to the actual translation, not, for instance, the entire cost of creating, printing or distributing such material, either in paper or electronic form, as those costs would apply to any materials. My aim in bringing forward this amendment is to make referendum material more accessible to those whose main language is not English. Just because an individual does not use English, for whatever reason, this should not be a limiting factor if they want to take part in a referendum debate. This amendment is intended to address any concerns that campaigners may have that the cost of providing translated material may result in them exceeding their expenditure limits. I hope members will agree with me we should make every effort to involve all members of our communities in a referendum debate and that they would therefore support this amendment, and I move Amendment 5.
Thank you very much. And I call Patrick Harvey.
Thank you. Just to say very briefly that I appreciate the fact that the government has taken forward this suggestion. I think all of us recognise that having accessible information from campaigners in languages, a range of different languages that are spoken in our communities, is an important part of enabling everyone to participate in the democratic process. And given that we are, I hope, about to pass other legislation expanding the franchise and ensuring that the right to vote is based on residency, not citizenship, a great many more people, I hope, will be able to participate in the democratic process, and many more of them will not have English as their first languages. I think it's going to be important that all political campaigns by parties and in referendums ensure that information is available that allows them and empowers them to do so.
Thank you. Does Mr Russell wish to add anything? We will move to the vote. The question is that Amendment 5 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I turn now to Group 8, Restrictions on Publications. Can I call Amendment 13 in the name of Adam Tompkins, grouped with Amendments 14 and 15. Adam Tompkins to move Amendment 13 and speak to all the amendments in this group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I move Amendment 13 in my name. This group of amendments is concerned with what is informally known as rules on purdah. That's to say that, as the law stands, for the last 28 days, the last 4 weeks of any referendum campaign, the government is prohibited from publishing information that provides general information about the referendum, that deals with any of the issues raised by the referendum question, that puts any arguments for or against any outcome in the referendum, or that is designed to encourage voting in the referendum. And the idea of having such purdah rules is well established now in our electoral practices. But we have taken evidence in the Finance and Constitution Committee that the relevant period that purdah applies for, just the last 4 weeks of the campaign, is too short and should be lengthened. But we've also taken evidence that in lengthening that period of purdah from the last 4 weeks to the whole of the regulated referendum period, which is 10 weeks, that the scope of the purdah rules should be narrowed. So the force of my amendments in this group is both to lengthen and to thin rules of purdah, so that the government would be prevented in the last 28 days from providing general information about the referendum and providing information that is designed to encourage voting in the referendum, but for the whole 10 weeks in terms of providing other information that deals with issues raised by the referendum question or putting any arguments for or against any referendum outcome. And this modest redesign of the rules of purdah was supported by a range of witnesses that gave evidence on the bill to the Finance and Constitution Committee at stage 1, including Alan Rennick of the Constitution Unit at UCL, who said that given that campaigns, as we all know, begin well before the purdah period, the rules do not prevent potentially influential government interventions in the campaign. And the Electoral Commission supported the view of Dr Rennick, pointing out that whereas referendum campaigners must work within statutory spending limits, government and public authorities may spend potentially very significant amounts of public money promoting their preferred outcome as close as 4 weeks before polling day. And the Electoral Commission have recommended that purdah should apply during the whole of the referendum period. That's to say, for 10 weeks rather than for merely 4 weeks. So in short, Presiding Officer, these amendments in my name extend the length of the purdah period from 4 weeks to 10 weeks, but narrow its scope, excluding from that extended 10-week period information that simply provides general information about the referendum or that is designed to encourage voting in the referendum.
Thank you very much. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It is a feature of debates about electoral regulation, particularly about referenda, that oppositions will seek to restrict purdah and governments will seek to maintain the present situation. And I call in evidence on that David Lidington during the EU referendum bill, who, defending the government against an attempt from the opposition, all the opposition parties, to restrict this, described the provisions in the Political Parties Elections and Referendums Act, which is still current and which we observe, as a very wide-ranging statutory prohibition on government activity. That's what it is. And I would resist further statutory prohibition on government activity. These new amendments would place tight restrictions on ministers for a period approaching 3 months in the run-up to a referendum. Now, pre-poll restrictions are accepted. They are effective. They are operating. As I said at stage 2, ministers, civil servants and public bodies expect those restrictions and they understand those restrictions. But extending them even further, even if slightly slimmed down from the original proposal that Mr Tompkins had at stage 2, would significantly inhibit the government from conducting normal day-to-day business on behalf of citizens. During stage 1, there was different evidence about this. The Finance and Constitution Committee acknowledged the uncertainty by deciding not to recommend an extended pre-poll period and then voted against the extension at stage 2. And I think that does indicate that whatever the intention in this, there is not widespread support for it. The 2016 EU referendum and the 2014 independence referendum had arguments cutting across a wide range of policy fields. Restricting all of those areas for more than the accepted and legislated for period will cause significant issues for the ordinary people of Scotland. Extending the restriction the way suggested would still catch a wide range of materials. Publish, the word publish, covers the spoken and written word and all forms of communication, including social media. This would constrain the publication of consultations, ministerial participation in public events, and that would be in any way associated with a referendum topic. Now, I accept it is hard to find the right balance. Everyone accepts that government should not use public funds and should not actively campaign at referendums. Politicians can campaign, but not governments. But equally, as the 5th report of the Committee on Standards in Public Life, which led to the UK prepare a referendum act in 2000, acknowledged, it is extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible, for the government of the day to offer purely objective and factual information in the course of any campaign. The report recommended that the government of the day in future referendums should, as a government, remain neutral and not distribute at public expense literature, even purportedly factual literature, setting out or otherwise promoting its case. Now, we could debate that, but that's not actually in these regulations. So I understand the concerns. I acknowledge that this will always be a current subject and there will always be debate upon it. But I don't believe these amendments take us any further forward, and there would be a difficulty in operating them and difficult to see what they could be replaced with. At stage 1, Professor Justin Fisher said that the area was an extraordinarily difficult area on which to legislate. I don't think these amendments do so. I would ask Mr Tompkins not to proceed with them, but we will continue to acknowledge that there should be vigilance in the use of purdah, and of course the Parliament will be as vigilant as everybody else.
Thank you very much. I call Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Just very briefly, if Scotland is involved in a further constitutional referendum, as I very much hope we are, and Adam Tompkins very much hopes that we won't be, but if that happens, it would be important that the two governments, UK and Scottish, are on a level playing field in terms of any restrictions on their ability. So can I ask Adam Tompkins, when he winds up on this group, can he tell us, does he propose a legal mechanism of placing the same restriction on the UK government from its activity as he proposes today for the Scottish Government, or does his amendment risk creating an inequality of arms?
And Adam Tompkins to wind up and to press his amendment.
Well, I'm not in the business, Mr Harvey, of proposing amendments which are out with the competence of this Parliament, and it's out with the competence of this Parliament to impose legislative restrictions on Her Majesty's People's Government. That answer. I think the government's response to this is disappointing. I have to say, this is the third set of amendments where the government are seeking to resist changes. Mr Russell painted a picture of it being about government versus opposition. It's opposition members who are seeking to promote these amendments and governments that are seeking to. It's got nothing to do with opposition and government. It's to do with respecting the views of those who understand national and international best practice with regard to the running and holding and conduct of referendums in this country. And on the Electoral Commission's statutory role of testing questions, the government have resisted. On the Gould principle, which I thought all parties agreed to, the government have resisted, and now also on PERDA. The government are resisting not amendments which I have dreamt up, presiding officer, but amendments which are seeking to put into effect the evidence that the Finance and Constitution Committee heard from the best available experts and from the Electoral Commission, whose job it is to ensure that the interests of voters are put first and foremost in the design and delivery of all referendums and elections in this country. So I think it is very regrettable that for the third successive occasion this afternoon, the government are seeking to resist not opposition amendments, but amendments which are designed to make the referendums bill reflect international best practice. This is subpar legislation, presiding officer, and it's disappointing that that's what the Cabinet Secretary wants for his legacy.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 13 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a division. This will be a 1-minute division on Amendment 13. The result of the vote on amendment number 13 in the name of Adam Tompkins is yes 56, no 68. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. Can I call amendment 14 in the name of Adam Tompkins? Adam Tompkins to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. And amendment 15 in the name of not moved. Thank you. We turn now to Group 9, details to appear on published referendum material. Can I call Amendment 16 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, grouped with Amendments 17 and 17A, the Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 16 and speak to the amendments in this group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. During the Stage 2 discussion, again on the 27th of November, when we were discussing the requirement to include imprints on referendum material and what exemptions for personal opinions are appropriate, Patrick Harvey asked, and I quote, "How can we distinguish those who are active campaigners but also publish on social media in their capacity as individuals? Where is the line between the individual and their identity as a campaigner?" It is an important point and it mirrors concerns that many of us hold. I therefore offered to discuss the issue further with Mr Harvey. Following those helpful discussions, I brought forward these amendments. They may not go as far as Patrick Harvey hoped, and I think his amendments show they don't go as far as he hoped, but I think we've arrived at what I hope is a workable way forward. The intention behind these amendments is to ensure that the personal opinion exemption from the requirement to include a name and address imprint on campaign materials does not extend to permitted participant campaigners, responsible persons for campaign bodies, or those who would be liable for corporate offences under the bill, such as directors and similar officers of companies of registered permitted participant campaigners. The amendments will remove the opportunity for those particular individuals to post referendum material without an imprint under the guise that it is their own personal opinion, unless it clearly cannot reasonably be argued as done with a view to promoting or procuring a particular outcome. I've limited the restriction to officers who would be liable for corporate offences, as people working for a campaign organisation may not necessarily identify with the views of that organisation, but are simply doing their job. This is more likely to occur with less senior members of staff. I don't think it would be appropriate to restrict them in the same way. By contrast, it's likely that senior officers will hold views in line with the organisation's campaigning stance. As I said during the Stage 2 debate, control of online campaigning is a difficult area and one we're trying to get right. However, we have to balance the need to regulate referendum activity appropriately without inhibiting the ability of members of the general public to discuss the issues involved. To do that would stifle debate and wouldn't benefit anybody. Having said that, let me just comment on Patrick Harvey's amendment. We've already discussed this amendment. The Electoral Commission's view, and we have, of course, lent heavily on the Electoral Commission's view in these matters, is that his proposed amendment is unfortunately unworkable. Campaigners are not required to report details of donations below £7,500 to the Commission. So it is unclear how the Commission would be able to enforce the imprint rules for those donating between £500 and £7,500, as the Commission would not be aware that these individuals were required to include an imprint on their communications. Apart from the practicalities, I am also concerned that these restrictions around the use of social media might act as a disincentive for people to donate to campaigners, or if they have donated, then to take an active part in the referendum debate. This is an evolving issue. It's very likely a future government will have to bring forward further changes in this area, potentially, for instance, using the power to amend the framework to respond to an Electoral Commission recommendation. Having said that, I would commend my amendments to members as a reasonable and proportional response at this time to the online campaign environment as it exists. I would ask Mr Harvey not to press his amendment on the grounds that while I am absolutely certain it is well-intentioned and I agree with many of the intentions, it couldn't actually work in practice. So, Presiding Officer, I move Amendment 16.
Thank you very much, and I call Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary is right to say that this is an evolving area. I'm quite certain that whatever passes in this bill will not be the last word on it, and that it's a complicated area. The concepts which we use to even talk about how we regulate online campaigning are themselves inadequate. The idea of a digital imprint almost implies that we think every piece of online campaigning is just the digital equivalent of a piece of paper posted through a letterbox or stuck up on a lamppost. Online campaigning is a far more sophisticated set of tools than that, and it requires a far more sophisticated model of regulation and enforcement, and this bill will not achieve that. Even with my Amendment 17A, this bill will not get close to achieving that, so there is a lot more work to do. But through the Stage 2 discussion, I genuinely found it difficult to understand a reason in principle why an online publication should be subject to a lower level of regulation than a physical publication. You know, a single tweet or a Facebook post can have a dramatically bigger reach than an individual who fly posts their community or who prints leaflets and puts them through the letterbox in their neighbourhood. That kind of campaigning does require people to say who they are. And the requirement for people to say who they are in online publications, and publications is what we're talking about, I don't see that as an inhibitor of freedom of speech. People do make the argument about freedom of speech. Simply being willing to say who you are, I don't see that as inhibiting freedom of speech. All I see it as inhibiting covert campaigning, which can be and has been an aspect of the manipulation of our democratic system, which I think we should all be concerned about. The amendment that I've lodged, 17A, simply adds in a requirement for those who've donated to campaigns. And I think it's clear that those whose money is being used to influence our democracy ought to be held to a higher standard of accountability than individuals who are simply chatting about the issues with their friends, whether online or offline. I don't see a reason in principle why donors should be excluded. It may well be difficult to enforce, and it may well be that the Electoral Commission wouldn't have the information it needs to enforce. But we don't make things lawful if we think that they're wrong simply because enforcement will be difficult. We should be setting an expectation of transparency and honesty in our electoral process, and I think an expectation that donors, those who use their money to influence the political system rather than just their votes, their energy, their creativity or their activism, those who use their money ought to be held to a reasonable standard, at least of saying who they are when they make publications online. So I move Amendment 17A. I have no idea whether it will get support from anybody else in the Chamber, but I think it's an important principle that needs to be asserted.
I call on the Cabinet Secretary to wind up on this group.
I do respect Mr Harvey's view on this. I entirely agree with him that the financial issues should not be excluded from this in any way. I simply say to him that the information that would be required to implement his amendment does not exist in the hands of the Electoral Commission and will not exist in the hands of the Electoral Commission. So whilst this will sit on the statute book, if it is passed, it cannot be operated. And I don't think we make good law if we put things in the statute book that we can't actually operate it because we don't have the information. So if the Electoral Commission comes forward with recommendations as it intends to do on these matters, we will look at those and try and implement them. But I would regrettably have to vote against this amendment because it can't be done.
Thank you very much. So the question is that Amendment 16 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 17?
Moved.
Can I ask Patrick Harvey to move Amendment 17A?
Moved.
That is moved. The question is that Amendment 17A be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We move to division on Amendment 17A. Members may vote now. This is a 1-minute division. The result of the vote on amendment number 17A in the name of Patrick Harvey is yes 32, no 61, abstain 30. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The question is that Amendment 17 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. We turn to Group 10, the investigatory powers of the Electoral Commission. Can I call Amendment 18 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, grouped with Amendments 19 and 20. Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 18.
I hope, Presiding Officer, we are in the last stages, the canter towards the end of the amendments. The Stage 2, I brought forward a number of amendments aimed at strengthening the Electoral Commission's monitoring powers to gather information about campaign activity. The Commission sought the strengthening of their power to obtain information so they could deal with compliance issues in real time ahead of a referendum. These amendments were agreed by the Finance and Constitution Committee. These further amendments refine those earlier amendments in response to further comments from the Commission. Amendment 18 adds an additional category to those individuals or bodies to which the Electoral Commission can give a disclosure notice. This new category covers individuals or organisations which have not registered as permitted participant campaigners, but which it has reasonable grounds to believe have published referendum material without an imprint or name and address details. Taken together with Amendment 20, a disclosure notice can require them to provide the Commission with information or an explanation. Amendment 19 is a minor clarification that a disclosure notice can cover relevant donations and regulated loan or credit transactions received or entered into before an individual or body became a permitted participant. This will ensure an individual or body who is not yet a permitted participant cannot avoid scrutiny by undertaking regulated referendum campaign activity before they register. This will enable the Electoral Commission to confirm that donations and transactions are correctly reported and whether an individual or body has carried out inappropriate campaign activity before registering as a permitted participant. These amendments add to those agreed at Stage 2, ensure certain aspects of the policy are more clear. Taken together, they represent a further strengthening of the Electoral Commission's monitoring powers in the campaign rules to gather information which could lead to a formal investigation. and I therefore move Amendment 18.
Thank you very much. The question is that Amendment 18 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I call Amendment 19? Cabinet Secretary to move. That is moved. The question is that Amendment 19 be agreed to. Are we agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 20?
Moved.
That is moved. The question is that Amendment 20 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. And our last group, Group 11, long title. Can I call Amendment 24 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, grouped with Amendment 25? Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 24.
Presiding Officer, these technical amendments are a result of the changes to Section 1 at Stage 2. When the option providing for a future referendum by regulations was removed, this meant the long title of the bill no longer reflected the contents of the bill. This means that the words about other referendums are no longer needed, so Amendments 24 and 25 adjust the long title accordingly. These are technical amendments which reflect changes already agreed to the bill, so I move Amendment 24.
Thank you very much. So the question is that Amendment 24 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 25. Thank you. The question is that Amendment 25 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed, and that ends consideration of amendments. Now, at this stage, as members might be aware, I am required under standing orders to decide whether or not, in my view, any provision of the bill relates to a protected subject matter, that is, whether it relates to a matter affecting the Scottish parliamentary elections or franchise. In the case of this bill, in my view, no provision of the Referendum Scotland Bill relates to a protected subject matter. That means it does not require a supermajority to be passed at stage 3. Now, we're going to move on shortly to the debate. I would just suggest to members that decision time is likely to be brought forward, so it's likely to be in roughly an hour's time. Merry Christmas. And so we'll just have a short pause before we move on to the debate. Short pause.
Parliament is suspended for 5 minutes. Please be back in your seats for 3:30.
How do you mean no more commission?
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was a balanced stone. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
About the work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.
Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause, well more than a year since Alison Thewlis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
The next item of business is debate on motion 20237 in the name of Michael Russell on the Referendums Scotland Bill at stage 3. May I ask those who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons, please? And I call on Michael Russell to speak to and move the motion for up to 7 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I start by thanking all of those who have been involved in shaping and developing this bill over the last few months. Very grateful to the Bill team who have done a tremendous job, to the two committees that have considered this, both Delegated Powers and the Finance and Constitution Committee. We've had robust debates in both committees, but I think they improved the bill and improved it substantially. And those members who have worked with me on bills before know that when I set off with a bill as a minister, I do think it can be improved, can be developed, can be changed and can be shaped for its purpose.
Excuse me, Cabinet Secretary. Can I say to all members, Parliament has recommenced. There should be no private conversations going on or backs turned to the chair. Please continue.
And it is perfectly possible to shape and develop a bill in a way that makes it a better bill, and that has happened in the case of this bill. And I'm grateful to each member who has done that. I hope today's debate as we come to the conclusion of this process, will perhaps restore some harmony, which has been somewhat damaged by the little debate we've had earlier on. I believe that we have worked very hard to try and move towards the resolution of the one significant difficulty that existed, and I think that we are, in actual fact, there. Ensuring that elections and referendums are run to the highest standards is central to any democracy. The rules by which electoral events are run should be clear, well understood, and promote open and inclusive debate. Sometimes we look around the damage that has been done in recent months to democracy, months and years, by the European referendum, and wonder if we can recover from that. Referenda do not have to be divisive in that sense, and indeed many people's experience of the 2014 referendum was a positive one. I would hope that we can move forward in a positive spirit to any future referendums in Scotland. If we do so, it's important that the rules for any referendums held on devolved matters are specifically suited to Scotland and debated and agreed by this Parliament. This bill therefore addressed a specific gap in a devolved legislative landscape. The purpose of the bill is to put in place a standing framework of conduct and campaign rules that could be applied to any national referendum on a devolved subject matter. My intention at the outset was to ensure that these rules meet the highest standards of electoral administration and regulation and reflect international best practice. This will ensure that the debate on a future referendum concentrates on the merit of the question, not on the nature of the poll. And I give my thanks again to those who have helped that to happen. And I want to also express my thanks to the electoral community in Scotland, who provided expert advice on the policy and technical issues raised by the bill. I first showed a slightly unnatural interest in electoral matters when I was a member of the Arbuthnot Commission on voting systems and boundaries more than 10 years ago, indeed more than 15 years ago, I think now. And I remain very interested in the issue of electoral law and electoral regulation. We are very well served, by and large, by the electoral community in Scotland, and they've engaged very fully in this bill and continue to engage in the work that will be required to make it real. I am open to considering continued issues, and as elements of this bill move forward, I am sure that the electoral community and others will want to make sure that they build upon the success of this bill to make it a reality when it is required. The changes to the framework can be triggered by a process within this bill. And we've limited that process, but it is possible to have dynamic legislation on elections, and that is something that I believe we have now achieved. We have further changes to make to the franchise, or a bill that is presently going through this Parliament, and at the conclusion of that, then I think we will have a system that is very much fit for purpose, and a system that is inclusive in terms of participation by all voters. And the technical adjustments we've made today add greatly to that, Presiding Officer. There are issues that we've not been able to resolve in this bill, or issues that have only been partially addressed. I give way to Mr Finlay.
Neil Finlay.
I believe the Cabinet Secretary has said that there's no other plans to have any other referendum other than a referendum on Scotland's constitutional future. I accept the right to pursue that, but does he not think that given where we are, when we don't know what's going to happen with Brexit, it would be irresponsible to press ahead with any referendum on Scotland's constitutional future until we know what is happening with Brexit?
Michael Russell.
Well, let me address that in two ways. The first one to say is that this bill does not create a Scottish independence referendum. No ifs, no buts. It's not what it creates. It puts in place the framework which could be built on by a Section 30 order or by legislation at Westminster. So this bill creates the circumstances in which we could have referendums, and it is certainly possible that people will come to this chamber with other ideas, and other governments will succeed this government. They may have ideas. This framework, therefore, is there to do that. The second answer I put to that is no, bluntly, I do not. I think it is very clear the nature of the Brexit we are facing for. The withdrawal agreement, now that the bill is within the UK Parliament, indicates what type of Brexit it is going to be. There is no such thing as a good Brexit. There are degrees of bad Brexit, and in terms of what we now know will take place, this will be a very bad Brexit indeed. So I think we are in a position to be able to judge very accurately what will happen in Scotland. For example, on matters of migration and on all other such matters. And I think, therefore, the sooner we are able to have a decision and to move on and to re-enter the EU, because regrettably it looks as if we're going to leave, the better it will be for Scotland.
Neil Finlay.
Absolutely clarify that the only reason you foresee for using this legislation is for an independence referendum?
No, I've never said that. In fact, I've given examples when I was giving evidence to Mr Simpson's committee of other areas in which I thought this bill could be used. What I am saying is that clearly there is an electoral mandate for, as Mr Finlay has accepted, an electoral mandate for an independence referendum. This bill does not deliver on that electoral mandate. This bill started before that mandate, the renewed mandate, was given. This bill puts in place a framework. It would be perfectly possible for somebody to come to this chamber next week and propose a referendum on another subject, and this bill would be there for use in that way. I see Mr Rumbles is thinking of what he could bring forward as a referendum, and I look forward to his ideas on that matter, so I do not accept the point. But let me move on. The reality of this bill is that it provides the best practice for a referendum, and we then move forward. But it doesn't necessarily, and Mr Harvey has made this point this afternoon, it doesn't resolve all the outstanding issues that exist. And those issues, for example, not just digital imprints, but issues of how democracy is changing and being influenced by some very malign influences, we need to continue to address. And we do so with the Electoral Commission, because we have been guided by the Commission at every stage of the way. We have sought to work with them at every stage of the way, and we have now got a bill that conforms with their requirements, I am sure, and that is a very useful thing to have. So, Presiding Officer, I look forward to hearing what others have to say. I hope this will be a constructive debate, and I hope it will persuade people who are not yet sure how they're going to vote later this afternoon to back this framework bill, which is a framework. It is not a bill that produces an independence referendum. There is no doubt about that at all. It is a framework which we needed to have in Scotland, and we now have, or almost have.
Call Adam Tompkins for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We all know the reality, Presiding Officer. This is not intended, and never was intended, by the SNP to be a framework bill for all referendums on any subject. This is a paving bill for IndyRef 2. The game is given away by the Cabinet Secretary's own demeanour and indeed overblown rhetoric when it comes to his absolute insistence that it is his right to rig the rules of the second independence referendum by bypassing the views of the Electoral Commission. There is only one relevant question to which his validity period applies, and that is the question put to the people of Scotland in 2014 about whether Scotland should become an independent country, and the answer, of course, was no. So the SNP want sometimes to pretend that this is a general bill, a framework bill for referendums in general, and other times they know that it isn't, because we all know that it isn't. It is a paving bill for a second independence referendum. Now, it is sensible to have framework legislation for referendums if you have, as a government policy, the idea that you are likely to use referendums in the future to decide things. But I have asked Mr Russell many times during the process of this bill, and indeed before the bill was even introduced, when it was first announced by the First Minister in a statement about independence. I asked even then, what are the subjects, other than independence, that this government proposes at any point to put to the people of Scotland in a future referendum? And answer came there, none. Because the only question that Mr Russell is interested in putting to the people of Scotland in a referendum is the independence question. So this is a framework bill for a second independence referendum, and it is a framework bill for a second independence referendum which is in breach of promise. Because in the independence referendum in 2014, the First Minister herself repeatedly said that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I will give way.
Stuart McMillan.
I thank Adam Tompkins for taking the intervention, but would he not agree with me that people can actually change their mind, such as Jackson Carlaw on his position regarding Brexit?
Adam Tompkins.
I take the First Minister at her word. I thought as a very loyal servant of the First Minister, the member would do the same. And the First Minister said many times in the 2013-2014 referendum campaign that that was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. That wasn't my insistence. It was her concession that in order to get people to vote yes in that referendum, she pretended that she would respect the result of that referendum, and it would be indeed a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. This bill has been promoted by the SNP in breach of faith, in breach of trust, and in breach of promise, and that is why the Scottish Conservatives will vote against it at decision time tonight. At the same time, Presiding Officer, this is a bill which is a missed opportunity. And the issues that Patrick Harvey raised at stage 3 earlier on this afternoon, and that both he and I sought to raise in committee at stage 2, are really important. If we are going to have a future in Scotland in which referendums are used more and not less, then we have got to do the work of understanding what the relationship is between popular democracy in the form of a referendum and parliamentary democracy in the form of this parliament. And we just don't. We don't understand what the relationship is between popular democracy and representative democracy in Scotland. And this bill should have addressed that question. And its failure to address that question is, I think, a lost opportunity. When should referendums be held? We don't know. This bill doesn't tell us. On what subjects should referendums be held? And why should referendums be held on those subjects and not on others? How often should referendums be held on the same subject? What do referendums even do? What happens in a referendum? Do they decide things, or are they mere expressions of opinion? And if they decide things, on whom are those decisions binding? Are they binding on us as individual MSPs? Are they binding on this Parliament? Are they binding on ministers? Are they binding on the government? And in what sense are they binding? What is the nature of the bind? Are they legally binding? Are they politically binding? Are they morally binding? Happily give way in 1 minute, Mr. Harvey. These are questions which, if we are really to understand, having a legislative framework for referendums, we surely need to have some grasp of what the answers to some of these questions are before we press the green button tonight. Mr. Harvey.
Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful. These are important questions, but would it not be regrettable if we passed framework legislation which took a restrictive view? For example, this legislation allows a referendum which is advisory, or one which is part of legislation which triggers a power or an action to come into force from government in the event that a referendum outcome goes a certain way. So it allows both decisive and advisory referendums. This is flexible rather than cutting down the number of options that a future Parliament might take.
Adam Tompkins.
That's right, Presiding Officer. There is a degree of flexibility about that, but it doesn't address the critical question, which is the question which, as Mr. Russell said in his opening remarks in this debate, has bedevilled British politics for the best part of 3 years. What is the relationship between something which is decided in a referendum and a Parliament which is then tasked with the responsibility of delivering on that result? This is a less bad bill than it was when it was introduced. There is no longer a power in this bill for Mr. Russell merely to click his fingers and for there to be magically a referendum by ministerial order, as there was in this bill when he introduced it. And the Electoral Commission's role in the testing of referendum questions, while significantly reduced and in a manner that cannot be forgiven and certainly won't be forgotten, has not been quite as obliterated as Mr. Russell would have wanted. But this afternoon we have missed opportunities to improve this bill with regard to revisions to the Purdah rules. We have missed the opportunity to improve this bill by implementing in statute for the first time in Scotland the Gould principle. But you know what, Presiding Officer, in the end it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter what this bill says, because the SNP know, and we all know, that this bill would only be used by the SNP for a second independence referendum. And thanks to the SNP, there isn't going to be a second independence referendum. We had a general election last week. The result of that general election was that we have the first Conservative majority government in the United Kingdom since 1992. So thank you to the SNP for ensuring that we had that election. Thank you to the SNP for ensuring that we have a Conservative majority government. And we'll note that the Queen's speech delivered by Her Majesty from the throne in the House of Lords this afternoon made it perfectly clear that this People's Government will not allow a second independence referendum. So it doesn't really matter what this legislation says. It's redundant already.
I call on Alec Rowley for around 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I said in opening the debate for Labour at stage 1 that if we as a country wish to move to a more direct democracy in which referendums were used more and more in decision making, the objectives of this bill and as they're set out would be sound. As a result of its scrutiny of the draft bill, the committee made a number of key recommendations on how to improve some of the fundamental flaws in the bill. and many of those recommendations have indeed been accepted by the Government, but crucially the recommendation on question testing has not. And today we will hear from many that this bill is an administrative procedure to facilitate future referendums rather than retaining the current ad hoc approach. In my lifetime there have been 6 referendums, 3 on a UK-wide basis and 3 specific to Scotland and the Constitution. The reason there have been so few is due to the fact that we live in a parliamentary democracy and abide by the principle of parliamentary sovereignty. Now, I'm not aware of any great demand or shift in public opinion to move away from that principle of parliamentary sovereignty. So the bill we are debating today is a bill to pave the way for an independence referendum to take place next year. Indeed, Michael Russell, when given evidence to the Finance and Constitution Committee, stated, and I quote, "We have never hidden the fact that I see this bill as being used by the Parliament and the Government to create the referendum for independence." And he went on to say the SNP have no other plans for any other referendums. So I say again today, Labour cannot support this bill on that basis. We believe that it is not in Scotland's interest to create, in the midst of the Tory Brexit chaos, even more uncertainty and more chaos. Indeed, I suggest that during this period, it would be impossible to put a clear proposition to the Scottish people. What I cannot understand is that the SNP say the 2014 referendum was a gold standard referendum, but now in 2019 they are trying to pursue a referendum where it would be impossible to know exactly what it was we were voting for. Perhaps that is the reason why they are so determined to rig the question. They say it has been tested time and again, but I say the proposition in 2014 and the proposition today are very different. What the SNP are proposing for next year's independence referendum is independence in Europe. Now, what we do know is that the deficit reduction that would be required for membership of the European Union would lead to years of massive austerity in Scotland. And that is before we even start counting the cost of the divorce bill from the rest of the UK, or the cost of having a hard border with England. The other point is that we really do not know if we would get entry into the European Union. Mr Russell tells us that Herman Van Rompuy, the former president of the European Commission, says that the path is open for Scotland to join the European Union. I ask, on what terms and what conditions would we have to sign up to? Never mind the fact that all 27 countries would have to agree. But I would also draw Mr Russell's attention to the comments of the European Policy Centre think tank, of which Mr Van Rompuy is the president. They said Scotland could not expect special treatment and that the Scottish Government would have to accept all the obligations of membership, including agreeing in principle to joining the euro. So before the SNP start rushing ahead for a new independence referendum to seek an independence in Europe mandate, I would suggest they must be able to explain exactly what that would mean for hard-working people in Scotland. All our efforts over this next year must surely be focused on minimising the damage that Brexit will do to our country. I think that is what the majority of people expect from this Parliament. The majority of people in Scotland expect from this government, and that is what they want. And that is why Labour will not support this bill today.
Colin Patrick Harvey for around 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to speak in favour of this bill, and I do that in the confident knowledge that there was pretty much no serious evidence submitted during this process that disagreed with the principle of having framework legislation on referendums. There was broad agreement that that was a good idea. There was also broad agreement that the bill as introduced wasn't adequate, and it has been substantially changed since then. Adam Tompkins says it is a less bad bill than when it was introduced, and it might be that that's the closest we get to high praise from Adam Tompkins on this, but it is true. This is a less bad bill. There have been significant improvements, and I believe those significant improvements are adequate to be able to support the bill itself. Referendums can be done well or done badly. That's true in relation to the practice and the process and the conduct and the legislation under which they operate. It's also true in relation to the political judgments and the nature of political campaigning in relation to those referendums. I think we have legislation here today which will improve the former. It will improve the practice, the process, the conduct, the legislation under which referendums in the future operate. But improving the politics of how and why we use referendums, what their purpose and meaning is in our democracy, that's something that we all need to take responsibility for as political actors. And I don't just mean we in this chamber, I mean we in our society, we in our democracy. There can be very little doubt, for example, that the argument Alex Rowley referred to about the sovereignty of Parliament is one which holds great importance for many people at the UK political level. But it doesn't always sit easily with the principle that we speak of in Scottish constitutional history of the sovereignty of the people. And that conflict is one of the things which has played out in chaotic and damaging ways at UK level in recent years. In fact, those very same people in the UK government who are today proudly and patriotically asserting the sovereignty of Parliament are the very same people who've been demanding that a wafer-thin majority in an advisory referendum conducted with dubious tactics at best represents the unshakable and unchallengeable will of the people and had to be implemented even to the point of illegally proroguing the UK Parliament. So those who assert one principle but live by another don't necessarily speak from the high ground in relation to these issues. I've argued since before this bill was introduced, I think, that Ireland is a place we should look to if we want to learn how to improve the politics of how we do referendums, of how and why we use referendums. Because in what could have been deeply divisive and polarising issues, Ireland did not simply frame referendums by giving it the job either to politicians or to an electoral commission. It actively brought in deliberative processes with citizen-led discussion about how to frame the questions, what questions should be put to referendum, how to frame them, and in that way, what could have been divisive and polarising questions in referendums were much more unifying experiences than they might otherwise have been. I don't pretend that we can solve every aspect of the challenges that we're going to face as we approach the next independence referendum, which I believe is coming. I believe it's necessary, but I do believe that improving the legislation is something we can do today. Improving the politics of how we do referendums is something that can't be done by a single bill, and it's something that we will all need to take responsibility for and learn the lessons of what we've done well and what we've done badly in the past.
Call Mike Rumbles. 4 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, all MSPs from across the chamber should be here speaking in support of a non-controversial technical bill to manage the detail of any referendums that take place in the future. Unfortunately, we're not in that position, because the bill before us this afternoon is certainly not just a technical bill, nor has the Scottish Government designed it as a non-partisan bill. No one is under any illusions here. It will pass the vote this afternoon with the votes of the two nationalist parties in this chamber and will be portrayed by the Scottish Government to the rest of the UK and indeed to the UK Government as the will of the Scottish people. It is, of course, no such thing. And it is no such thing because the two nationalist parties have fixed the terms of this bill for their own partisan advantage. The Independent Electoral Commission is being bypassed over the issue of the question the nationalists want to re-put to the Scottish people. The Electoral Commission has said, and I quote, "We continue to be of the view that should a future referendum on Scottish independence be brought forward, the Commission should be required to reassess the question regardless of whether it will take place within the validity period. This will ensure confidence in the legitimacy of the referendum result." Both Mike Russell and Patrick Harvey tried to hoodwink us over the view of the Electoral Commission. But Mike Russell also said that the validity period only applies to the current session of Parliament. He is wrong. Let me read the relevant section of the bill for him. In subsection 7, the validity period means that the period composed of the session of the Scottish Parliament in which the proposed date of the referendum falls and the preceding session. I would like to know if Mike Russell really is in charge of the content of his own bill or whether he's trying to hoodwink us again. Now, I think that Mike Russell for the Scottish Government has been too clever by half, a charge which is often put to him. He has almost single-handedly, but not quite single-handedly, thanks to the Nationalist Greens, put what should have been a non-controversial bill before us and turned it into a nationalist charade. The mask has indeed slipped with the nationalists today. I've only got 4 minutes, I'm afraid, and I note Patrick Harvey complained about my use of this phrase, but it is a very apt phrase. Mr. Harvey pretends to be holier than thou, but the Greens have put their nationalism before fairness, and how often have we heard that? But no question, if I had more time, I would do so. I do have time, therefore I'll give way.
Patrick Harvey.
With the best will in the world, I would not call Mike Rumbles a British nationalist, and I don't think he would thank me if I did. Would he please pay the rest of us the same courtesy?
Mike Rumbles.
No, because that's exactly what the Green Party is. It is a nationalist party, and to pretend it's not a nationalist party is quite amazing. This is not a nationalist government that seeks to legislate for the good of everyone in Scotland. This bill proves that without doubt. Also, on the very day the First Minister asks the UK government for a Section 30 order, this bill ensures that no sane UK government of any colour would indeed accede to this request for a referendum under these rules in this bill when the nationalist parties have fixed the terms of the question. It convinces me, actually, that the nationalists really are playing a game with the future of our country. I don't actually think they expect another referendum to take place. But here we go on a long line of grievance, because no government, as I say, would be in their right mind to transfer such power to this government when it's trying to fix the question. Presiding Officer, this is a bill which does try to fix the question the way the Scottish Government wants to fix it. And the two nationalist parties don't have the courage, they just don't have the courage to actually say that. We believe, because of this, the bill stains our democracy, and as such the Liberal Democrats will be voting against it in the vote this afternoon.
We move now to the open debate, and can I have speeches of 4 minutes, please? And I call Bruce Crawford, followed by Alexander Burnett.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In the time we have available today in this important debate, I want to do two things. But before I do that, Presiding Officer, can I say I'm disappointed in some of the boorish and rude language I've heard from some members this afternoon in this debate. It's unbecoming them. So to begin, I want to look at the principled, entirely reasonable and well-supported case for having a referendums framework legislation on the statute book. However, I also want to spend just a short time exploring the wider matter of Scotland's undeniable democratic right to choose her own future. Firstly, although I'm not speaking today as the convener of the Finance and Constitution Committee, I want to put on record my grateful thanks for the fantastic support I received from committee clerks throughout the passage of the bill. But I'll move on to why all parties in this chamber should support this bill at decision time. The policy objective of the bill is to put in place a generic framework for referendums and provide the technical arrangements for the specific future referendums. The policy objective, it's safe to say, found almost total support across the electoral professionals and academia. For instance, it was the view of the Electoral Commission that the bill would help to provide clarity of the rules for anyone administering or campaigning at a particular referendum. The Scottish Assessors Association welcomed the bill on the basis that there would be one set of legislation to govern all referendums in Scotland. The Electoral Management Board for Scotland's view was that rationalising existing laws to create a single consistent framework governing referendums offers benefits to the voter, to campaigners, the regulators and electoral administrators. They saw the bill's proposals as wholly positive policy direction. The Institute for Government said that they saw the overall policy objective as a good one and that standing legislation is preferable for the purposes of consistency and to prevent manipulation of the rules. Dr Alan Rennick of the Constitution Unit strongly welcomed the proposals for a standing legislative framework, and among others providing supportive comments were Dr Theresa Reedy and Professor Toby James. Therefore, those of us in this chamber who are genuinely interested in following an evidence-led path when placing legislation in the statute book should support this bill when it comes to decision time this evening. Okay, now let me conclude with a short comment on the result of last week's general election and the vital importance of recognising and implementing the outcome of the democratic process. And in doing so, let me recognise the achievement of the Conservatives in winning a majority. I may despair at the outcome, but respect and face that reality I must. But so too must the Tory party in Scotland respect and face the reality of the outcome in Scotland. Yes, the election was a victory for one nation conservatism, but that one nation was England. Scotland chose a different path, and our democratic wishes must be respected. If the Conservatives on a vote share of 43.6% and a seat share of 56.1% claim a democratic mandate for the UK to leave the EU, then how can any argument stand against the democratic legitimacy of the outcome in Scotland, where the SNP share of the vote was 45% and the seat share was an emphatic 81%. So I say, in all seriousness to the Tories, the democratic voice of Scotland will be respected and the people of Scotland will choose their own future.
Alexander Burnett, followed by Neil Findlay.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Now, we could have been spending the last moments of this year in Parliament debating something important to the majority of Scotland. We could even have been spending this precious time passing legislation under the SNP's own programme for government. Education, that was what the First Minister announced as her #1 priority for this government. The NHS, that was what the First Minister proclaimed as having a duty to protect. Climate change, that was what the SNP declared as a national emergency. But oh no, here we are again, forced to debate a bill that no one, save those looking to divide the country, are supporting. And not only is this legislation unwanted, but it is also being rushed through with undue haste. Now, if the SNP argue that this bill is the most important bill of their government, why are they not giving it the scrutiny it deserves? Because according to figures from the Scottish Parliament, if it passes today, this bill will have only had 205 days to be scrutinised, well below the average of 271 days. And to give this some context, only 3 bills in this parliamentary session have received less time, and these are the budget bills. Now, I would ask, certainly.
Bruce Crawford.
I'm grateful to Alexander Burnett for giving way. Can you give us an example of where in the process of scrutinising this bill the committee process of this Parliament failed that process, or indeed where extra time should have been built on and for what purpose?
Alexander Burnett.
I think we would all have wanted more time for the Electoral Commission, as one example, to give its agreement for the bill that's passing. And it's very sad that that hasn't occurred. Now, I would ask why the record-breaking speed for a bill that no one wants, and what devolved matter is so pressing that it requires a referendum. But such a question is, of course, rhetorical, because we all know the answer. The bill is yet another fig leaf on the SNP's eternal quest for breaking up the United Kingdom. And an eternal quest it will remain. For Scotland said no in 2014, and nothing, I repeat, nothing, has changed since then to give cause for another. Only the SNP's interpretation of the numbers gives them the belief of a mandate, an interpretation matched only by their educational failings in maths. So I have one question for the Cabinet Secretary, and it concerns the method of declaring the winner of any referendum. Now, my understanding is that referendums are decided on the total number of votes cast across the whole of the electoral region. However, last week, the SNP won the most seats in Scotland due to the vagaries of the first-past-the-post system. Yet they claim the majority support, despite 55% of Scotland voting against them and their wish for separation. So can the Cabinet Secretary confirm that the result of a future referendum in Scotland will be decided on the majority of voters and not the 32 counting areas? Now, in other parts of the bill, we have supported changes, but they have not gone far enough. The role of the Electoral Commission remains insufficiently strong, and the manner in which the Cabinet Secretary has tried to hijack so many parts of the process has more in common with third-world dictatorships than the transparent democracy of the United Kingdom. But of course, the SNP are only pushing this through today, as they told their nationalist extremists that they would get this bill through Parliament by the end of the year. And this is simply not good enough, and Scotland deserves better. And I'm proud to say I will not be supporting this bill today, and I know my constituents will thank me for it. So let's start prioritising what is important. Education, the NHS, police, nurses, climate change, welfare, local government, our communities, jobs, economy. Take your pick. Because the only reason we are here today talking about the Constitution is because the SNP are failing on everything else. So let's hope the new year brings the change Scotland wants. Thank you.
Neil Finlay, followed by Angela Constance.
Thanks, President Officer. I regret very deeply the election result last week. I believe that many of the working people who voted for Boris Johnson will soon become the victims of his divisive political agenda and philosophy. In Scotland, the SNP won the election convincingly. There is no doubt about that. Their election pledges to lock Boris Johnson out of Downing Street and stop Brexit were, of course, nonsense. They alone could never deliver that, no matter how much they pretend they can or they could. As a Democrat, I accept the people are sovereign. I accept the election result. And I accept that when a party can carry a majority in Parliament, there is the right to introduce and pass any bill that gains the necessary supports. From that starting point, I would have been inclined to support this bill. But at decision time, I cannot vote yes for the following two key reasons. First, driving ahead with a call for a referendum in 2020 would be a huge mistake. Brexit will have major implications for our economy, our society. We have no idea yet the implications for jobs and trade and immigration and border arrangements, security, intergovernmental relationships, financial transactions, and so much more. And if we add to that, if we add on top of that, the hundreds of issues that need to be addressed in Scotland if it were to become an independent state, issues such as currency, central bank, pension levels, EU membership and the terms of it, how we could adhere to a 3% budget deficit, how we would fund public services when Barnett goes, these are huge and very serious questions that need credible answers. We cannot have a repeat of the fantasy that was the 2014 White Paper. It would be completely irresponsible for any independence prospectus to be put forward without knowing the real day-to-day implications of Brexit for our people. This cannot be done in 2020. Secondly, I cannot support a bill that seeks to pockle the referendum question. If a referendum is going to happen, it must be completely fair and credible and, importantly, seen by all to be so. Because attempting to manipulate the role of the Electoral Commission or manipulate the question is just plain wrong, Cabinet Secretary. I appeal to you. It's plain wrong. It leaves the government wide open to the charge of trying to fix or manipulate the referendum from the outset. And you can shake your head all you like, but that's how it will be seen. It will erode confidence. It will erode trust and goodwill from the outset. And if the Minister thinks this is the way to bring people on board who were previously opposed to a referendum or even independence, then I have to tell you, it's exactly the wrong way to go about it. Finally, can I say to my own party, we have wasted 8 years from the 2011 election through the 2014 referendum to the present day, where we have failed to come forward with a credible, workable, coherent alternative to independence. We have been reluctant and grudging when proposals for devolved power came forward, seeing it as a concession to nationalism. I am no nationalist and I never will be, but I see the devolution of power to the lowest possible level as the natural and desirable democratic order. Labour must now get its act together very quickly. Hard oppositionalist unionism is the road to oblivion, in my opinion. The people want change, and I think that should be a Devomax proposition that should be based on the principle that all power should be devolved unless there's an overwhelming reason not to devolve them. Presiding Officer, I don't like abstaining in this place, but tonight I will. The Government has the right to proceed with the referendum, but doing so before clarity over Brexit is putting party interests before the national interest. I appeal to the Minister at this late stage. Do not do it.
I call Angela Constance, and Angela Constance is the last of the open contributions in this debate.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. During the Stage 1 debate, I made clear that as a lifelong supporter of independence, I wanted our journey to be inclusive and built on the best international standards, and that the key decisions should rest with this Parliament and not with ministers. And this bill, as it now stands, allows for this Parliament to scrutinise the merits of any proposed referendum, the question to be asked and the timing. It is Parliament that is now in the driving seat. And I very much hope and believe that there will be a new independence referendum. But the real question at this point in time is, will the UK Government give this Parliament the legal authority to respect the democratic right of the people of Scotland to choose their own future? Or will Boris Johnson continue to ignore and say no to the people of Scotland? And I know the Prime Minister's supporters will say that we don't have a mandate. On one level, they have a point. We have mandates, plural. We have a cast-iron mandate from elections in 2016, 17 and 2019. And I would never want to reduce an argument to ours is bigger than yours, but at the end of the day, our mandate is bigger than yours. And it is absolutely galling to hear a party who have not won an election in Scotland for 60 years to arrogantly assert that they have a veto. And they would do well to remember. We would do well to remember that Scotland is a country and a voluntary union of nations. And I accept the results of elections. The results of the 2014 Scottish independence referendum and the 2016 UK-wide EU referendum are indisputable facts. Painful facts, but indisputable. But I do wonder if some of those opposing this bill today accept the indisputable fact that 62% of resident Scots voted to remain in the EU and now face the prospect of being dragged out of the EU against their democratic will. Do they accept that democracy can never be a one-off event? Do they accept that people and citizens always have the right to change their mind, particularly when there is such a change in circumstance? And if Brexit has taught us anything, surely it is what not to do if you want to persuade and lead. And it is worth reflecting that it was not the SNP Scottish Government who ripped up the UK Tory Government's rhetoric on respect or their so-called partnership of equals. The Tories managed to do that all by themselves. And I believe history will show that ignoring the highest Remain part of the UK will indeed lead to the demise of the United Kingdom. And I think the Tories know this. Presiding Officer, I have never in my political life subscribed to any notion of Scottish exceptionalism. What we are faced with today is a tale of two governments. It is a tale of two countries that continue to make very difficult political choices. And because of those difficult and different political choices, I believe that now more than ever we need to escape Brexit and ensure that Scotland's future is in Scotland's hands. I am Angela Constance, and Mike Russell, I am proud to say I'm a nationalist. But can I also say to those people in the Labour ranks, times have changed since 2014. There will need to be a new case for independence if there is to be a new referendum. And it will be up to me, the SNP, the Scottish Government and that wider Yes movement to make the case that independence and everyday bread and butter issues are indivisible. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I want to end by wishing everyone a Merry Christmas and here's to the new year.
We move now to the closing speeches, and I call Pauline McNeill for 4 minutes, please.
As a nation, we have not looked to using the referendum process as much as other European countries. Ireland was given as an example, except, of course, on big questions such as Scotland's future, our relationship with Europe, vivid in our minds, the 2014 referendum following the Edinburgh Agreement in 2012, the EU membership referendum in June 2016, but probably most of us have forgotten we did have another referendum on the alternative voting system. I always forget that one. But well before 2016, it was Nicola Sturgeon who said that there should have been a requirement prior to the 2016 referendum to have a majority in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. I wasn't in the Parliament when she said it. I did agree with her. Perhaps more people in hindsight might have thought that was a good idea. But this bill we're looking at tonight, is a framework bill on any referendums held in Scotland that are within the competence of the Scottish Parliament. This would be the framework legislation. It seems to be a change from previous practice and it comes to the question. In its current form, the bill is unacceptable to us and we believe the government has failed to take on the strong and fair view that they should not set the question, but rather the question should be rigorously tested by a third party, namely the Electoral Commission. And I'm not too clear why we're changing the practice that has previously been used, because the central issue for us is the question that should be tested. And Section 1 of the bill allows for Scottish ministers to make regulations to provide for holding a referendum, deciding the date, the form of the ballot paper, the wording of the question and the referendum period itself. Section 3(7) allows ministers to specify in subordinate legislation the wording of referendum without having the necessity of consulting the Electoral Commission. Presiding Officer, this is not a neutral position that the government are taking, because it's an odd position to find yourself as a government who wants to take forward legislation, ask a question, whether it's on independence or any other matter, and not have that question tested by a neutral body seems to me to be opening yourself to an accusation, at least, that it isn't a process of which you have some integrity around. The Cabinet Secretary has shifted, and I see what you've done there, but you have not shifted enough. It's not a small difference, as Cabinet Secretary Michael Russell said earlier. It's quite a big difference in allowing the Commission to give expert advice and by requiring the law any question to be. It must be a matter of law that the question should be tested. It shouldn't be a matter where simply the Parliament to ask if it so wishes. I don't regard that as a major concession at all, and I think you're risking the integrity of the process. As Neil Findlay said earlier, what are you scared of here? I'd like to address the question of a future Parliament, something that Patrick Harvey spoke about. It isn't comfort to me either that a future Parliament may decide to open that up, particularly if there's a majority for independent parties in the Parliament. And in that scenario, to me, it would still be an imperative in order to make the process to have some integrity where that was the scenario, that a neutral expert body would decide the rigour of the question. And even if the question has been asked before, what the Electoral Commission said during the process is that they like, during the 12-week process, to take the public opinion into account to see if there ought to be an adjustment to the question. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, as Neil Findlay said, in 2020, This is the year we do need to focus on the damaging implications of a poor Brexit deal. We have supported the government up until now. In their approach, we'll continue to do that, and the return of powers from Europe to Scotland through the process. Last week was a very devastating process for the Labour Party. We need time to reflect on the results and how we will represent Scotland's best interests. But it's clear to me that Scotland rejected the Tory government last week, and it remains the biggest threat to the Union. Next year will be a difficult year for the country, and I plead with ministers in this government to focus on using this Parliament's voice as we tragically leave Europe, and use that time to influence the process in the best interests of Scotland. Thank you.
I call Murdo Fraser. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm not sure the debate we've just had in the last hour has added a great deal to our understanding of the bill, and I'm not sure arguments have moved on very much from the Stage 1 debate just a few weeks ago. But one thing we are clear about is what exactly this bill is about. Because despite what the Cabinet Secretary said at the outset, this is not a bill about referendums in general. And we know that because there are no referendums in prospect in this country, except the one that the SNP are so keen on, namely a second independence referendum. Throughout the parliamentary progress of this bill, civil servants were unable to name any other topics that might be put to a referendum. And indeed, there's no popular tradition of holding referendums in this country except on matters of the Constitution. And the Cabinet Secretary has been quite explicit in stating that the bill is being used and will be used by Parliament and by the government in due course to create a referendum for independence. So this is a bill not about referendums in general, not about whether these should be a more significant part of our legislative arrangements, and Adam Tompkins opened up quite an interesting debate as to whether or not that should be the case and what rules might govern that. But it's a bill about one thing, and that is the question of a referendum on independence. And if there were any doubt about that, I think what we've heard in speeches around this chamber makes that absolutely clear, that those on the unionist side see this very much as a bill only about independence. And in that respect, we've been very clear. And Adam Tompkins reminded us, we'd had a referendum in 2014. We were told at the time it was a once-in-a-generation vote. Indeed, the current First Minister said it was a once-in-a-lifetime vote. And there is, in our view, no justification for rerunning that referendum now. Now, SNP speakers will claim, and Bruce Crawford and Angela Constance both did this, that the general election last week changed the territory. But we know that there were SNP candidates in that election who were denying this was an election about independence. We know there were SNP candidates who made it explicitly clear that a vote for them was not a vote in support of independence. And yes, I will.
Gillian Martin.
I believe that the member is referring to the candidate for Gordon, who I know very well. In fact, what he was saying was that people could put a vote in for him for Scotland's right to have the choice. Would you deny Scotland having the right to choose its future?
Murdo Fraser.
It wasn't just the candidate in Gordon. There were other candidates who were making very similar claims. But even if we accept the argument that a vote for the SNP was a vote for another referendum, an argument I reject, even that argument only won 45% of the popular vote. So there is no mandate, no popular support for another referendum. And on that basis alone, Parliament should be rejecting this bill. Well, there's another reason why Parliament should be rejecting this bill. It is because it represents a power grab by the Scottish Government. Because in relation to the issue of the wording of a referendum question, the Scottish Government have been reluctant to move from its previous position that reuse of an existing question means it does not have to be retested. That was contrary to the view of the Electoral Commission. And despite the sophistry we've heard from the Cabinet Secretary earlier this afternoon, the Electoral Commission are very clear in the comment they've made to this Parliament this afternoon. They continued, and it's a direct quote, "We are continue to be of the view that should a future referendum on Scottish independence be brought forward, the Commission should be required to reassess the question regardless of whether it will take place within the validity period." That is crystal clear, Deputy Presiding Officer, and the Cabinet Secretary has not accepted the view of the Electoral Commission. And this is an important point in the context of a potential future independence referendum, because we know that in any referendum on which a yes or no question is asked, those on the yes side start with an inbuilt advantage, because yes is a positive and affirming word, and it's easier to get people to agree to a proposition than to disagree with it. Precisely why, in 2016, the question was framed not yes or no, but rather leave or remain. And that is why the role of the Electoral Commission is so important, and these are not matters that should be determined entirely by the Scottish Government. As it stands, this bill represents an attempt by the SNP Government to gerrymander the outcome of any future referendum and rig its terms to give as favourable as possible an outcome to the SNP. That should not be acceptable to this Parliament. Presiding Officer, Mr Rumbles made it clear when he said this bill, if it's passed today, will be trumpeted by the Scottish Government as the next step towards another independence referendum. And he's right. And there's no coincidence about the timing of this debate this afternoon, on the very day that the First Minister is demanding Section 30 powers from Westminster. If Parliament passes this bill, it will be announced as the next step towards an independence referendum.
Could we quieten down conversations, please?
Carry on, you have another minute. This is a bill about just one issue, a future independence referendum. We don't want another referendum. The public don't want it. In the general election last week, the party who supported another referendum couldn't even get half of the votes cast. Parliament should reject this bill at decision time this afternoon. And whether you support the bill or reject it, Presiding Officer, I wish you all a very happy Christmas.
I now call Michael Russell to wind up the debate for around 6 minutes, please, Mr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start by wishing everybody in the chamber a Merry Christmas and a Good New Year? Nola Crea Agus Bliana Vaur. I start with that because I suspect that the tone may deteriorate from here on in. So I'd like to get my good wishes in first before it does so. Can I also start with Mr. Rumbles? I have to say that his speech was amongst the silliest I've ever heard in this chamber, and I've heard some very silly speeches in this chamber. Particularly because he said at one stage during the debate that he was now not going to support the bill. Can I quote him at stage 1 of the bill, where he said, "We do not support the bill and will not vote for it." So his change of mind isn't a change of mind. I also would point out kindly to Mr Rumbles that his 2 contributions to this bill have been a speech at stage 1 and a speech at stage 3. He has not attended any of the committee sessions. He has not heard the committee. People who were not members of the committee moved amendments in the committee. He chose not to do so. So one could call him a spectator of this bill rather than a participant in this process. But the prize today for the most extraordinary statement has to go yet again to Alexander Burnett, who said, and I quote him, I suspect it will not last for long. He said, "Nothing has changed since 2014. Nothing has changed since 2014. If I may at this religious season of the year quote a hymn, that may be true for the rich man in his castle. It is not true for the poor man at his gate." Electorally, in 2015 at the general election, the SNP won. In 2016 at the Scottish Parliament election, the SNP won. In 2016 at the European referendum, 62% voted to stay in the EU. In 2017, the SNP won. In 2019, the Tories lost 7 seats. Nothing has changed, of course. Everything remains the same. Well, it may remain the same for Mr Burnett. It does not remain the same for the poorest and the most vulnerable. It does not remain the same for the 200,000 European citizens. It does not remain the same for small businesses who will not have the labour they need. It will not remain the same for public services. Nothing has changed. That sums up the Tory position. And Angela Constance was right to say how galling it was to hear what the Tories had to say, because nothing has changed for the Tories. They believe that they can continue to go on as they are, despite the fact that the people of Scotland have told them to stop. And if they believe that they can ignore the people of Scotland, then I'm afraid they have an even greater shock coming than they saw last Thursday. Because it was extraordinary, the insulting way in which the Tory party treated this debate. They thought it was of no relevance to anybody. They want it over with because they don't believe that the people of Scotland should be listened to. The people of Scotland have spoken. They, the people of Scotland, there we have Murdo Fraser. There we have Murdo Fraser. There we have Murdo Fraser. Nothing has changed,
Order,
apparently.
please.
There is Ruth Davidson indicating, pointing her finger at me, that nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. She isn't even the leader of the party anymore. That is what has changed.
Colleagues.
At least we have been spared the spectacle of her swim in Loch Ness. Only just. This is, presiding officer, a framework bill. It provides the opportunity to move forward. And I was interested in what Neil Findlay has to say. I don't agree with Neil Findlay. That will not be a shock to anybody. Not even seasonal goodwill would make me agree with Neil Findlay. But he has a key point here. Because the reality of the situation is the Labour Party needs to change where they are on these issues. And I do think it is regrettable that they have not looked at this issue today and said, in those circumstances, let us as a party abstain on these matters because we are consulting. Well, let's see who does. Because they are consulting and thinking about their future. I think that is to be regretted because I can also say that this bill is the gold standard. But this bill is the gold standard. Sorry. Now you see, it suits the Conservatives, as we hear every FMQs, it suits the Conservatives to run down what is happening in Scotland and the good things that are happening in Scotland, because their only selling point is to say Scotland is so terrible that you must allow it to be run from Westminster. And that is no longer a tenable situation. The reality is this is the gold standard, but I am always willing to enter into discussion, even with Mr Findlay, especially with Mr Findlay, to see if we can do more, to see if we can find a way for things to improve, to make sure, of course, I give way to Mr Findlay.
Neil Findlay.
On the 2 points I made, attempting to manipulate the role of the Electoral Commission and the question, and the insanity of having a referendum at the same time as we do not know what is happening with Brexit. Will you address those 2 points?
Cabinet Secretary.
I have to say, if not now, when, look at the circumstances we are in, we're about to be dragged out. We're about to be dragged out of the EU against our will. But according to Neil Findlay, that is not enough to allow us to vote on our own future. But I am willing to have that dialogue, because this is a framework bill. There is no proposal in this bill to hold an independence referendum on any date and with any question, and that is important. But just on the question of the Electoral Commission, this government has worked very hard and closely. If you look at what I've said today, at every single part of the bill we have worked with the Electoral Commission. This is the gold standard. The Tories don't want it to be, because the Tories don't want a referendum. But a final point, presiding officer, they have already agreed there should be one. I shall look forward to reading the official report, because when Mr Tompkins was getting very excited about the question, he seemed to make it clear that an independence referendum was about to happen. Don't rush us, Mr Tompkins, don't rush us. We have a campaign to have, but I'm sure that campaign will produce the result that Scotland wants. If the Tories refuse to listen to Scotland, then that will be their final wake-up call. I move the resolution in my name.
Thank you. That concludes the Stage 3 debate. I am now minded to accept a motion without notice to bring forward decision time to now, if the Minister would move such a notice. Motion. The question is that we bring forward decision time to now. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. So there's one question to be put as a result of today's business. The question is that motion 20237, in the name of Michael Russell, on Stage 3 of the Referendums Scotland Bill, be agreed. And members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion 20237 in the name of Michael Russell is yes 68, no 54. There were 2 abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed and the Referendum Scotland Bill is passed. Thank you. And on that note, I close this meeting. I wish members a Merry Christmas and I look forward to seeing you in the new year. I close this meeting.
How do you mean no more commission?
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was balanced on. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
About the work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.